The fountain ran at the same time it always did. It was not a beautiful fountain. Nobody had ever called it beautiful. It sat at the junction of two pedestrian corridors in the founder-tide quarter of Coruscant's mid-levels, a basin of circulating water installed during a civic project so old that the administrative record of who commissioned it had been lost to 3 separate archival reorganizations. The stone around the basin was worn smooth by the hands of people who had sat on its edge for decades. The pump that kept it running hummed at a frequency that the people who passed it every day no longer heard. In the early mornings, before the lower markets opened and the corridor traffic thickened into its daily density, the sound of the water was the loudest thing in that particular junction. Not loud, just present. The way ordinary things are present, completely, without announcement, in the manner of something that has always been there and expects to continue. A maintenance worker arrived at the basin just before first light. He set down his equipment case with the specific economy of someone who has done the same task in the same location more times than he has counted. He did not look at the fountain before he began cleaning it. He already knew what it looked like. He knew the particular discoloration on the southwest interior wall of the basin, where the water ran slightly uneven, where minerals from the recycled water supply had left a pale streak over years of running. He knew the crack in the third paving stone to the left that he had reported twice and that had not been repaired. He knew the sound of the pump on a normal morning versus the sound of the pump when it was cycling unevenly and would need maintenance within the week. This morning, it sounded normal. He cleaned the basin. He left. The fountain kept running. Arda Sulis walked the same route every morning she was on Coruscant. She had walked it for 4 years as a knight, and for 3 years before that as a senior Padawan permitted to travel the temple district independently. 7 years of the same route, which meant she had seen the founder-tide quarter in every season, in every hour of light and dark. She in the quiet of Senate recesses and the congestion of summit weeks when the corridors filled with diplomatic delegations and their attendant security details, and the whole mid-level breathed differently for a few days before exhaling back to normal. She knew the route the way she knew the grip of her lightsaber hilt, not as a series of conscious choices, but as something that lived in her body and did not require thought. She passed the fountain at the time she always passed it, early enough that the lower market was only beginning to open, early enough that the maintenance worker was still working, and nodded to her as he did most mornings, without either of them breaking the quiet. She passed the fountain and did not look at it directly. She heard it, the pump, the water in the basin, the small sound of ordinary infrastructure doing its ordinary work. She was reciting names, youngest first. That was the order she had settled into without deciding to settle into it. It was simply the order that felt right, that felt like the correct direction of attention. The youngest student in her morning class was 9 years old. His name was Pell. She said his name quietly, under her breath, in the way that requires almost no breath at all. Then Sarah, who was 10. Then Yawin and Marit, both 11, whose force attunement expressed itself in completely different registers. Yawin, physical and precise. Marit, intuitive and sometimes alarmingly accurate. Then 3 12-year-olds, Devan, Ika, Torith. Then 2 13-year-olds, Rue and Cassel, who had been in the same cohort since their earliest temple years and had the specific shorthand of people who have grown up in proximity to each other. And finally, Sael, who was 14 and left-handed and held tension in the left shoulder, the oldest of the group, the one who stayed after class to ask questions. She said all 9 names in the time it took to walk from the fountain to the lower market's first stall. She did not know she was memorizing something. She thought she was keeping track. There is a difference, or there seems to be one, between those two things. Between the administrative act of knowing your students' names and the act of learning the shape of them, the specific weight of each one in the mind. The way that a name said, often enough, begins to carry the face and the habit and the particular quality of presence that makes one person distinct from every other person in the galaxy. She thought she was keeping track. She was not keeping track. She was doing something that did not have a name yet, that would only acquire a name later when the reason for it became clear. The lower market was waking up, stalls opening their shutters in sequence, the metallic sound of it familiar and layered. A vendor arranging produce from one of the hydroponic levels 3 corridors east, greens that were still wet from their growing environment, deep and specific in color. The smell of fresh bread from a bakery that had operated in the same location for longer than Arda had been alive. A transport repairman crouching beside an open panel in the corridor wall, running a diagnostic on something that was making a sound it shouldn't. His tools arrayed beside him with the neatness of professional habit. 2 children, not temple children, district children, already moving through the corridor with the purposeful energy of people who had somewhere to be, school or an errand. Something that required them to be places at specific times. Ordinary Coruscant, the mid-levels in the morning, everything in motion, everything continuous with everything that had come before it. Arda walked through it and felt the city, the way force sensitives feel the spaces they know well. Not as a passive sensory experience, but as something textured, dimensional. She alive with the specific signatures of many thousands of ordinary lives going about their ordinary business. She had been trained since childhood to be aware of this, not to intrude upon it, not to use it, but to be present within it. To know that she was part of a fabric, to know what the fabric felt like when it was whole. The Senate Plaza was busier than she expected. She noticed it before she had fully processed why. A difference in the quality of movement, in the density of people on the formal pathways, in the expression of the security personnel at the plaza perimeter. Not an emergency. Not that specific sharpened attention that preceded a crisis. Something else. Something quieter and, in its quietness, more persistent. People moving with the slightly compressed energy of people who had received information they were not certain what to do with. Small clusters of aides and attachés speaking in the lowered register of conversations that were being had in public that would normally be had in private. A senator. She did not look to identify the affiliation, it didn't matter. Moving toward the Senate building with 2 security escorts, and not slowing at the intersection to wait for the pedestrian signal the way you were supposed to. Something was different about today. She filed it. She kept walking. She entered the temple district. The Jedi temple in the early morning was always occupied. It was never empty, never had been, in all the time Arda had walked its corridors. Thousands of people lived and worked and trained and studied and simply existed within its walls, across its many levels, from the archives in the lower reaches to the meditation chambers at its heights. It breathed continuously. She knew the sound of it, and the sound this morning was different in a way that was not dramatic, but that she felt in her chest, below the level of thought, in the part of a force sensitive that processes the world before the mind has assembled language for it. More masters in the halls. Not more than usual in the way that happens during training cycles or important ceremonies. more in the way that means people who are normally elsewhere have been called here, or have come here without being called. Because the thing that they all sense as weather in the chest has a different pressure than it had yesterday, and they are congregating the way that people congregate when they do not yet know what they are waiting for, but know they should not be far from each other when they find out. Closed doors, the council chambers, 3 of the senior master consultation rooms, the lower strategy room, which was not often used, and whose use, when it did occur, was not announced. Arda walked the length of the main corridor toward the training wing, and she passed Master Torvan Ress coming the other direction. Her master. Her former master, technically, since she had attained knight status 4 years ago, but the relationship did not change its nature simply because the formal designation had. He was moving with the specific economy of someone who had already been in several meetings this morning and was on his way to another, and he paused when he saw her. "Early," he said. "Morning class," she said. He looked at her for a moment in the way he had always looked at her. Not at her face exactly, or not only at her face, but at the whole of her presence, the attunement of someone reading more than the surface of a conversation. He had been doing this since she was his Padawan. She had stopped being unsettled by it years ago. "How do they feel to you today?" he said. Not a question, really. An invitation. She considered. "Pressure," she said. "The kind that doesn't have a name yet." He nodded once. His expression did not confirm or deny anything. That, too, was familiar. He moved on. She watched him go for a moment, and then she did not watch him go, because there was a class to teach, and the students were already gathering. The training room was on the 3rd level of the eastern wing. It was a good room, the right proportions, the right floor surface, enough open space for footwork exercises and paired practice without crowding. The morning light came through the upper windows at this hour, at an angle that was useful for demonstrating how stance affects the relationship between a body's center of gravity and its ability to respond to what comes from above. She had noticed this on her first morning in the room, and had since organized her lightsaber footwork sequences around it. The students came in, one by one, and in pairs. She watched them enter the way she always watched them enter, not performing observation, but actually observing, noting the specific quality of energy each one brought into the room on a given morning. Children have moods like weather systems. They are not subtle about it to someone paying attention. Pell first, who was 9 and small for his age, and very serious about being small, as if he were managing it as a condition that required management. Sarah behind him, who was 10, and moved through doorways with the slight apprehension of someone who has been told enough times to be careful, that she has internalized the instruction more than was intended. Then the 11-year-olds, the 12-year-olds, the 13-year-olds in their pairs and singles, arranging themselves in the room's space with the particular mix of ease and self-consciousness of children who have been in the same training group long enough to be comfortable, but who are still, most of them, in the years of becoming. Sael came in last. Not late, just last, in the unhurried way of someone who was not worried about being last. 14 years old, left-handed, carrying the kind of quiet attentiveness in the eyes that Arda had noticed from the first class, and had been paying attention to since. Sael took a position at the back of the group and waited. Arda began the class. She started with the footwork sequence she had been developing with them over the past weeks. A transition between 2 defensive forms that required the kind of patient repetition that children of this age either found meditative or found maddening, depending on their temperament. She demonstrated the sequence at half speed, calling the positions as she moved through them, and she watched each student attempt the first transition. Join executed it cleanly. Join almost always executed the physical components cleanly. His attunement was physical. His body understood what his mind was told before his mind had finished processing the instruction. Marit was less precise in execution, but moved with an instinctive responsiveness that was doing something technically different from what Ardeva had demonstrated, and that was, in its difference, not wrong. It was the beginning of something specific to Marit's own physical relationship with the Force, and Ardeva noted it and let it develop rather than correcting toward uniformity. She moved through the group. She corrected a grip, Devan, 12 years old, gripping his training saber 2 millimeters too far back on the hilt, which would cost him leverage in a real engagement. She demonstrated the correction. She watched him apply it. She moved on. She spent a long time with Sael on the footwork transition. Not because Sael was struggling. Sael wasn't struggling exactly. Sael was doing something more interesting than struggling. Sael was asking the question that the footwork sequence was designed to answer before the question had been formally presented. The sequence moved from an open defensive stance to a closed one and back again, and it required the practitioner to commit to each transition fully before reversing, because hesitation at the midpoint created a physical vulnerability that an opponent could exploit. The lesson embedded in the sequence was about commitment, about the difference between strategic flexibility and the hesitation that comes from being unwilling to be fully in one position before moving to another. Sael was already doing this, committing fully, then transitioning fully, back and forth, with a decisiveness that was more instinct than training. Ardeva watched this for a moment before offering any correction at all. "What are you thinking about when you transition?" she asked. Sael considered this seriously. "The next position," Sael said. "I'm thinking about where I'm going, not where I am. Is that useful?" A pause. "It makes me commit to the transition," Sael said. "If I'm thinking about where I'm going, I stop being uncertain about leaving where I was." Ardeva looked at this student for a moment. 14 years old. Thinking about commitment and certainty and the mechanics of being fully present in a position before moving out of it. She said, "That's one way. We'll talk about whether it's always the right way." Sael nodded, stored this, continued. Class ended. At the time, it always ended. She sent them to their next lesson, to the older masters, to the archives, to whatever the morning held for each of them. They left in the same mixed sequence of pairs and singles they had arrived in. Sael was last again, and at the door, Sael paused and turned back. "When do you leave?" Sael asked. Ardeva had not announced an upcoming deployment to her students. She looked at Sael with the slight recalibration of someone reminded that attentiveness runs in both directions. "A few weeks," she said. "When you come back," Sael said, "will you tell me how it actually goes? Not the version for the briefings. How it actually is." Ardeva looked at this 14-year-old standing in the doorway with the morning light from the corridor behind them, asking with perfect seriousness for the truth rather than the version of the truth that was appropriate for someone their age. She felt something that was not quite recognition and not quite warning and not quite either. "Yes," she said. She meant to keep this promise. On Dromond Cars, a garrison apartment in the city's outer military district smelled of industrial coolant and Kasi stone. These were the two smells Verith Casson associated with the concept of home. Not fondly, exactly, but completely, in the way that things you have always been around are not experienced as pleasant or unpleasant, but simply as real. He was packing a deployment kit for the third time in 2 years. The kit was already organized from the last deployment. That was his habit. When he returned from a deployment, he repacked the kit before he did anything else. Before he ate or slept or sat down, because the repacking was the ritual that meant he was ready, regardless of when the next order came. His father had done this. His father had told him once that a soldier who kept his kit ready was a soldier who had made peace with the fact that the next order was always closer than it seemed. Verith had not fully understood this when he was told it. He understood it now. He worked in silence and with the efficiency of someone for whom this process was genuinely without anxiety. He was not afraid of deploying. That was not the thing he felt when the orders came. What he felt was something more complex and less comfortable than fear. Something in the range of a recognition that the life he had when he was not deployed was not fully real. That the garrison apartment and its smells and its smallness and its particular quality of ordinary time were a space between deployments rather than a life in its own right. He did not know whether this was a problem. He did not know what he would do about it if it was. He checked his equipment manifests as he packed, going through them in the order he always went through them. Armor components, personal kit, medical supplies, personal, not unit, weapons, secondary tools. He said the names as he checked each item against the manifest, a habit from his first deployment that had become unchallengeable routine. And beneath the habit of checking names against manifests, in a rhythm that ran alongside it without interrupting it, he was saying other names, the soldiers in his unit, from his first deployment, in order. He had started this after the third death of his deployment career. The first and second deaths had happened, and he had processed them in the way that the Imperial Army processed casualties, efficiently, without public performance of grief, with the institutional movement forward that was part of how the Empire understood loss. The third death was different, not in kind, but in timing. The soldier had been there in the morning and was not there in the afternoon, and the gap between those two states, the morning presence and the afternoon absence, was so small and so complete that Verith had needed something to do with it. He had started the list. He had written the name down, then the first and second going back, then everything after. He did not know he was memorizing something. He thought he was keeping a record. He was not keeping a record. He was doing the thing that people do when they refuse to let time make the dead abstract, which is to say the names until the names have weight, until saying them is an act rather than a recitation. He said the names quietly, she under his breath, the same breath he was using to count manifests. The two rhythms ran in parallel without interfering with each other. He was good at this, at holding more than one thing at once, at attending to the practical and the other kind of attention simultaneously. His commanding officer had once described this as useful and meant it as a high compliment. Verith had understood it as a compliment, and also as a description of something in him that he had not chosen and was not sure he would choose if he had the option. From beneath the spare uniform, he pulled the history text. Republic Agricultural History from an Outer Rim archive, captured during a border operation in his first year of service. It was not classified, not particularly interesting from a military standpoint, not the kind of document that anyone had thought worth specifically redacting or securing. It had been in a crate of miscellaneous archive material, and Verith had picked it up, and he had read it, and he had kept it. The text was about crop rotation cycles on Ryloth, and the way the Twi'lek agricultural communities had organized their growing calendars around the geological quirks of their world. Not a military document, not a political document, simply the recorded life of people living on a planet, doing the things that people on planets do to survive. He had found it on his first reading oddly calming. He had found it on rereading something more than calming. He had found it honest in a way that very little of what he was regularly given to read was honest. It did not have a political position. It was simply what happened on Ryloth. He placed the text in the kit, beneath the spare uniform, in the place he always placed it. He completed the manifest check. He sealed the kit. He looked around the apartment once, the habit of checking a space you are leaving, making sure nothing essential has been forgotten. Nothing had been forgotten. Nothing here was essential except the kit which he was taking with him. He left. On Coruscant, in the Foundertide Quarter, the afternoon light reached the junction of two corridors and fell on the fountain there. The way afternoon light falls on things that are still and horizontal and surrounded by the movement of everything else. The market had reached the full pitch of its midday activity. The pedestrian corridor was its busiest. A group of children was floating pieces of refuse in the fountain basin. Small scraps of packaging material, a broken seal from a food container, things that the city generates in endless low quantities and that children find endlessly adaptable to whatever game is currently being played. The maintenance worker was long gone. The fountain did not know about children using it for things it was not designed for. It ran. It made its small sound. It was not beautiful, and it was not remarkable, and it had been running here for longer than any of the people currently walking past it had been alive. Somewhere in the outer rim, at a distance that would take hyperspace travel to close, in the dark between known coordinates, a fleet of ships was moving. It had been waiting for a long time. The waiting was over. The specific quality of the waiting being over was not yet known to anyone on Coruscant. It would be known soon. It was already written in the movement of fleet positioning and supply chain logistics and the Dark Council's operational calendar, written in the language of things that have been prepared for long enough that their happening is no longer a question, but only a matter of time. The time was very nearly now. The fountain ran. The children played. The city moved around the junction of two corridors in the Foundertide Quarter, with all the completeness of a civilization that does not know what is coming toward it from the dark. The afternoon held. Somewhere at this same hour, on a transport moving through the dark between Droman Kaas and a staging point whose coordinates Verith Casson had not yet been given, the hull was making the sound that military hulls make in hyperspace. A low structural complaint, the sound of materials under pressure, the sound of going faster than things were built to go. The soldiers in the troop bay were sleeping or not sleeping. The ones who had been in the army long enough were sleeping. The ones for whom this was early were awake in the dark, listening to the hull, wondering what the sound meant. It did not mean anything except what it always meant, that they were in transit, that they were between the last place and the next one, that for the duration of this particular darkness, nothing was asking anything of them except to wait. The water ran in the Foundertide Quarter. It would still be running when the sound came. The sound had not arrived yet. The silence came before the sound. This is what survivors reported later in the accounts that were collected by people whose job it was to collect such things. The medical officers, the intelligence debriefers, the Republic archivists' field correspondents who arrived on contested worlds in the aftermath and asked questions of whoever was still capable of answering them. The survivors from Coriban's Republic garrison described the silence first, before they described anything else. before the humming, before the fire from above, before all of it, there was a moment, brief, total, wrong, when the ambient sound of the garrison installation simply stopped. The equipment kept running. The ventilation kept cycling. The communications arrays kept their low electronic hum. But something underneath all of that, something that had been present so continuously that nobody had ever consciously registered it, was gone. And in its absence, before anyone had processed the absence consciously, the body knew. The body knew before the mind did. The hands tightened. The breath held. The eyes moved to the sky without instruction. Then the humming came. Her name was Liss Orvan. She was 22 years old. She had been assigned to the Coriban garrison communications post 8 months ago, which was long enough to know the installation's rhythms and short enough that she still occasionally experienced a specific background surprise at being here, rather than somewhere else, at having been routed by the Republic military's assignment logic to this particular post on this particular world, which was not a comfortable assignment or a prestigious one, but which she had accepted with the pragmatism of someone who understood that the military's logic and her preferences were largely unrelated variables. Coriban was not a comfortable world. It had not been comfortable in a very long time. The planet's surface was desert, red stone and ancient architecture, and the persistent, low-level wrongness that everyone in the garrison felt and nobody discussed, because there was no useful thing to say about it. The Sith had been here. The Sith had built here centuries and millennia ago, before the Republic's last major military reckoning with them had pushed them from this space. The tombs were still here. The Academy ruins were still here. The Republic garrison occupied a cluster of functional structures in the Valley of the Dark Lords, positioned to monitor and deter, and whatever the planet itself felt about this occupation was not something Liss Orvan spent time considering. She had a communications post to run and manifests to file, and a superior officer who was very particular about the formatting of shift reports. The morning of the Coriban action, which is how the Republic record initially described it, action, because nobody had a larger word yet, started in the way that Liss's mornings on Coriban always started. Shift change at first bell equivalent, status check on all relay frequencies, confirmation of the patrol schedule with the garrison's eastern monitoring post, a cup of something that was described on its packaging as caf, and that was not quite caf, but was caffeinated and warm, which was sufficient. And the first anomaly was on the deep-range passive sensor array, a density reading at the system's outer edge that was inconsistent with normal traffic patterns, but consistent with. The array's interpretation algorithm offered several possibilities in descending order of probability: debris field, gravitational disturbance, multiple large objects moving in formation. Liss looked at the reading for a moment. Then she opened a channel to her superior officer and reported it. Her superior officer, a lieutenant named Darvin Creel, who was thorough and competent and who had been on Coriban for 2 years and had processed 17 anomalous sensor readings in those 2 years, of which 16 had been debris fields or sensor artifacts, told her to flag it, log it, and send a query up the chain. Standard protocol. She flagged it. She logged it. She sent the query up the chain. The chain was the regional command node, which would route the query to the appropriate assessment office, which would respond within. The standard response window was 6 standard hours for a non-critical anomaly. The fleet arrived in 40 minutes. What Liss Orvan understood in the minutes between the sensor reading and the arrival of the fleet was almost nothing. That is not a criticism. It is simply what was true. She was operating on the information she had, which was a passive sensor reading and a flag and a query, waiting for a response that would not come in time. She was not operating on the information that would have told her what the density reading meant, that it was the forward elements of an imperial fleet whose full scale had been building for a century in secret. That the query she had sent up the chain would reach an assessment office that had also received similar queries from 2 other outer rim posts in the last 8 hours, and was in the process of upgrading those queries to urgent when the fleet entered the system, that the silence before the humming was not a mechanical phenomenon, but was the Force's response to the concentrated approach of something vast and dark and long suppressed, and that no part of the Republic's monitoring and response infrastructure had been designed to respond to this, because nobody had seriously planned for this, because planning seriously for this would have required acknowledging that it was possible. She did not know any of this. She knew the sensor reading was wrong. Wrong in the specific sense of being inconsistent with the baseline pattern she had been monitoring for 8 months. She knew the query was filed. She was checking the relay frequencies when the silence came, and then the humming. She had no word for it. No one on Coriban had a word for it. It was low, much lower than a sound the ears process first. It was something the chest processed before the ears caught up, a vibration that came from above and outside, that came from the direction of the sky, that grew from barely perceptible to unmistakable in the time it took Liz to stand up from her station and move to the installation's exterior sensor feed. What the sensor feed showed her was the underside of ships, a great number of ships, more ships than she had reference for, more ships than the Republic garrison on Coriban had any prepared response to. She stood at the feed and she looked at it, and her hands were already on the emergency distress relay before her mind had completed the sentence it was trying to form. She opened every available channel. This is Coriban Garrison Communications Post. Designation RC7. Broadcasting on emergency relay frequencies. We have... She stopped. She did not have a word for what she had. The word she reached for was fleet, and the word was insufficient, and she used it anyway. Multiple capital ships in the system, currently in low orbit positioning. Requesting immediate contact with regional command. Requesting immediate contact with any Republic vessel in range. Broadcasting on all. The signal was not getting through. Not on all frequencies simultaneously, which meant this was not equipment failure. Something was suppressing the relay. A jamming capability she had been told theoretically existed, but had never encountered in operational reality. She switched to the hardline burst transmitter, which required physical activation on the other side of the installation. She ran. She ran in the way that people run, when their body has decided that velocity is the only appropriate response and the mind is just trying to keep up. She ran past Lieutenant Creel, who was at his own station, and who looked at her with the expression of someone who has received information. They are attempting to reconcile with everything they believed about the morning they were in. She did not stop to speak to him. She reached the burst transmitter room. She activated the transmitter. She began her message again. Garrison coordinates. Sensor data. Ship count. She used the number the feed had shown her, and the number was wrong, too low, because the feed was showing her the forward elements and not the full fleet, but it was the number she had. She compressed the message into a burst transmission, and she sent it, and then she sent it again, because the protocol for burst transmissions under jamming was to send 3 times and assume only one would reach its destination, and accept that even that was not guaranteed. She sent it a 3rd time. She did not know if it arrived anywhere. The humming, by this point, had changed. It was louder. It was the kind of loud that requires no equipment to measure, the kind that exists in the body's response to it, in the teeth and the sternum and the specific biological frequency at which extreme sound stops being perceived as sound and begins being perceived as pressure. Then the fire came from above. The Republic Archivist's post-war record lists Liss Orvan under communications personnel, status unconfirmed. This designation has a meaning within the Republic's military archival system. It means that the record did not contain sufficient documentation to confirm a specific fate. It means she was there, and then she was not there, and the gap between those two states was never filled with certainty. Status unconfirmed. The fountain in the Foundertide Quarter was still running when this designation was assigned to her name. The fountain did not know about the designation. It ran anyway. The staging world had no name that Verith Casson had been given before he arrived. The orders called it by a coordinate designation, a string of numbers that described its position in the outer rim without telling you anything about what it was like to be standing on it. What it was like to be standing on it, flat and cold, and possessed of a sky that was the particular grey of a world that receives enough light to see by and not enough warmth to be comfortable. The installation was recent, built within the last few years, everything still carrying the specific newness of infrastructure that has not yet been worn into familiarity. The ground around the installation's landing pads was bare and hard. The air tasted of nothing. There were a great many soldiers here from many units, and the assembly of them in this place had the quality of water being collected behind a dam. A great deal of organized, purposeful potential, waiting for the thing that would direct it. Verith's unit arrived in the early morning of the staging world's local cycle. They were processed through arrival protocols. Manifests checked, assignments confirmed, temporary quarters designated. He performed all of this with the efficient cooperation of someone who has been through arrival protocols enough times to execute them without engaging fully. His attention was elsewhere. His attention was on the ships. He had seen Imperial ships before. Everyone who grew up on Dromund cars had seen Imperial ships. The garrison vessels, the patrol craft, the occasional capital ship transiting the car system on its way to somewhere the population was not informed about. He had shipped out twice before on military transports. He understood ships as military infrastructure. He thought he had a reasonable working model of what the Imperial fleet looked like. He did not have a reasonable working model of what the Imperial fleet looked like. What was rising from the staging world's landing fields and orbital platforms in the hours after Verith's arrival was not a fleet in the sense that he had used the word before. It was something that the word fleet had been waiting to mean for a long time and had not yet meant. It was the accumulated mass of a civilization's preparation. 100 years of construction in secret, of resource allocation and shipwright priority, and imperial engineering working in parallel across a dozen concealed installation sites across the unknown regions and the far outer rim. The ships that were rising were enormous. They rose in sequence, not chaotically, not with the energy of urgency, but with the deliberate, ordered momentum of something that has been prepared to this exact degree of readiness and is now, for the first time, doing the thing it was prepared to do. He stood outside the staging installation's main structure and he watched them rise. He stood there for a long time. Nobody told him to move. The soldiers around him were watching too. The new arrivals, the ones who had not seen this before. The veterans who had been stationed here longer watched the new arrivals watch the fleet, with the expression of people who remember having that experience and understand that it is not repeatable. You see it once for the first time. After that, it is something you know. The first time is the only time it does the thing it does, which is this: it removes the last internal reserve of doubt. Verith had believed what he was told about the Sith Empire's history. He had believed it with the believing of someone who was raised inside a narrative and had examined it seriously and found it, on examination, to be substantially true. He believed that the Republic had pushed the Sith from their space. He believed that the exile was real and that the 1,000 years in the dark were real, and that Droman Kars and everything built there was real, genuinely built by real people, his father's people, his uncle's people, in conditions that were not good and that they had survived anyway and made something from. He believed all of this. But belief and the thing that happens when you see the fleet are not the same thing. The thing that happens when you see the fleet is not a new argument. It is not additional evidence. It is a physical experience of scale, of what it means that a civilization spent 100 years building in secret, that every ship rising from these fields represents years of labor by people who were doing it because they were told that what they were building it for was real and necessary and theirs. The fleet was physical evidence that the preparation had actually happened, that nobody had been lying about the seriousness of it, that the thing he had been told he was part of was actually the scale it claimed to be. He did not feel triumph looking at it. He did not feel the specific elevation of emotion that the recruitment speeches had been designed to produce. He felt something simpler and more complete than either of those things. He felt that it was true. He stood there until his unit was called to the briefing structure. Then he went. He did not look back at the ships. He had seen them. He knew them now. That was sufficient. In the briefing, they were told the target. They were told the objective. They were told that the operation had already begun. They were told that Coriban had been reclaimed. The briefing officer used the word reclaimed. He said it with the specific weight of someone who has been trained to use it, not the weight of personal conviction, but the institutional weight of a word that has been put into official usage and is expected to do a particular kind of work. Reclaimed, as if the word itself was the corrective to everything the Republic had spent 1,000 years calling it. Verith wrote the word in the margin of his assignment orders. Below it, he wrote, "So it begins." Then he folded the orders and put them in his kit beside the history text, beside the piece of cloth from his uncle, beside the list. He did not say names that night. He did not have new names yet. He sat in the temporary quarters on the staging world, and he listened to the sound of ships moving overhead, a different sound from the humming, the sound of his own side's fleet in motion, which he was supposed to find reassuring and which he found instead simply large. And he thought about the Republic agricultural calendar on Ryloth, the crop rotation cycles, the way a civilization organizes its growing season around the specific conditions of the world it lives on. He thought about the people on whatever worlds were in the fleet's path, who were also, tonight, trying to organize themselves around the specific conditions of their worlds. And then he stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it was not useful, and the alternative to thinking about it was sleep, and he had a deployment in the morning. Arda was woken at the 3rd hour of deep night. The summons was not dramatic. A quiet chime from the temple's internal communication system, a voice she recognized as one of the senior Padawans assigned to the council's night liaison function, saying her name and the words council chamber, priority assembly. Nothing else. The voice was steady and trained and careful, in the way of someone who has been told that how you say a thing matters as much as what you say. She was already sitting up when the chime finished. She had been not quite sleeping for the last several hours, in the lighter zone of rest that force sensitives occupy, when the pressure in the chest is present enough to keep the mind from going fully quiet. She had been in that zone since she left the temple the previous evening. Something had been moving toward her. Not toward her specifically, but toward everything. And she was in the path of it, the way everything was in the path of it. She dressed. She walked the temple corridors in the deep hours when they were quieter but never empty. She passed 2 other knights moving in the same direction. They did not speak. The silence between them was not awkward. It was the silence of people inside the same weather system, moving toward the place where they would find out what the weather was. The council chamber was not the full council. It was the masters who had been in the closed sessions the previous day, plus several senior knights, plus the temple's military liaison officers. Too many people for a routine briefing. The right number of people for the beginning of something that had not been begun before. She found a seat. She looked at the faces around her. The faces told her something before anyone spoke. She was good at reading rooms. She was good at reading people. These faces were carrying the specific weight of people who have received information they have fully processed but have not yet accepted, who know what they know and are still in some remaining interior space, hoping it means something different than it means. Master Torvan Res was standing to one side of the chamber. He was looking at the floor. He was not looking at the floor because there was something on the floor. He was looking at the floor the way people look at neutral ground when they are holding something that requires all of their available stillness to hold. The senior master spoke. She said, Coriban. She said, fleet. She said the word that Verith's briefing officer had said with institutional weight, reclaimed. But she said it differently. She said it as a quotation, a word the other side was using. A fact about language rather than a fact about geography. She gave coordinates. She gave the timeline as it was known, which was partial. The passive sensor anomaly at 1 hour. The jamming at 40 minutes. The distress burst at a window she named, and then a gap. The gap was not yet filled. The gap was where the complete information would eventually go, when there was complete information. She said what the gap meant in terms of the garrison's status. She said it once, clearly, and did not say it again. Arda sat in her chair, and she listened. She performed the calm she had been trained to perform, not performed in the sense of falseness, because the calm was real. She had learned to be genuinely calm. She was capable of genuine calm even in this, but it was performed in the sense that it required effort. Beneath it, something was moving. Not fear, not yet. Fear had a specific shape she recognized, and this was not its shape. This was older than fear. This was the knowledge that the thing she had felt as weather in the chest for days was not a precursor to something. It was not a warning. It was the beginning of the thing itself, and the thing had already begun, and the beginning had already cost something that could not be returned. The chamber worked through the immediate response logistics, which vessels, which communication chains, which diplomatic contacts needed to be activated at what priority. It was efficient. The masters were good at this. The efficiency did not require them to stop feeling what they were feeling. It ran alongside it in parallel, the way Verith's name recitations ran alongside his manifest checks. 2 rhythms, neither interfering with the other. She listened. She absorbed. She said nothing that was not asked of her, and several things that were. After the chamber emptied, she stayed. The lights in the council chamber were not dimmed after the briefing ended. They remained at their working level, the same clear, neutral light that existed during the session, illuminating the empty chairs in the same manner as the occupied ones. It did not make the emptiness dramatic. It just showed it plainly. She sat in her chair, and she did not recite names. She thought about beginning the recitation, and she stopped. The recitation required her to know what she was reciting toward, required the list to be the list it was, complete as it currently stood, not yet added to. And she understood. She's sitting in the empty chamber, in the middle of the deep night of a city that did not yet know what had happened while it was sleeping, that the list was not what it had been yesterday morning, that the shape of what it meant to say names, youngest first, keeping track, not memorizing something, had changed in the hours since the first ships arrived over Coriban. She did not yet know what names to add. The information was not yet complete. The gap was not yet filled. So she sat in the silence of the chamber, and she held the incomplete information, and she waited for the morning in which the lists would be longer, and the names would need saying, and the galaxy would have the thing it had been building toward for 1,000 years. The fountain ran in the Foundertide Quarter. The city was still sleeping. It did not know yet. There is a version of Ardeva Sulis that existed before the war made its demands on her, and that version is harder to describe now than it should be. Not because it was complicated, because it was complete. Because completeness, once it is gone, resists reconstruction. You can name its parts. You can describe its textures, but the thing itself, the way it felt from the inside to be that person in that life, does not survive the gap between then and now intact. Something is always lost in the translation. She knows this. She describes it anyway, in the way that people describe things they cannot fully recover, carefully, with the awareness that the description is not the thing, that the map is not the territory, that naming what was there is not the same as having it back. She was a Jedi Knight who taught children in the mornings and read case files in the afternoons and meditated in the evenings and slept well at night. This sounds simple. It was not simple. It was the result of years of training and years of practice and the specific ongoing discipline of someone who had been given a framework for living and had decided deliberately and repeatedly to inhabit it fully rather than perform it from a distance. She was not a perfect Jedi. She was a Jedi who tried, which is a different thing, and she had come to believe a more honest one. Perfection in the Force was not what her master had taught her to reach for. Her master had taught her to reach for presence, to be where she was, fully, without reservation, without the part of the mind that stands outside experience and comments on it. To be in the room she was in, to be with the person she was with, to be doing the thing she was doing, without dividing her attention between the doing and the watching of the doing. Master Torvan Res had taught her this over 7 years as his Padawan, and he had taught it in the way he taught everything, not through direct instruction primarily, but through the accumulated evidence of how he moved through the world. You learned from Torvan by watching him long enough to understand what he was actually doing, which was different from what he appeared to be doing on the surface. On the surface, he was a Jedi master of significant standing, respected in the temple, trusted by the council, deployed regularly to the kinds of situations that required a combination of combat capability and political sensitivity. Below the surface, which became visible to Ardeva slowly over years as she developed the attunement that close proximity to a master produces, he was a man who had been paying very careful attention for a very long time, and had accumulated from that attention a specific kind of knowledge about what things actually cost. She understood this about him better after he came back from the Minos cluster skirmish. Before the war had a name, before the fleet, when the first encounters with Sith Imperial advance forces were still being described by the Republic military as border engagements and by the Senate Information Bureau as isolated incidents requiring diplomatic resolution. Torvan had been sent to the Minos cluster because the incident there had stopped being isolatable and had started being something the Jedi needed to assess directly. He had been gone for 6 weeks. He came back and he was not physically damaged. No wounds, no medical notations in his return file. All systems functionally intact. He was walking differently. It was a very small difference. Most people who saw him in the days after his return would not have registered it. Arda registered it. She had been watching how he moved for 7 years. She knew the specific quality of ease in his stride. The way a long-trained Jedi moves when they are at peace with their body, and their body is at peace with the space it occupies. This was not present in the same way after he returned from Minos. Something had been adjusted, not reduced, not diminished in any way that implied damage or loss of capability. Adjusted, as one adjusts to carrying additional weight, as if there was now something he was carrying that had not been there before, and his body had reorganized itself around it. She did not ask him about it immediately. The timing had to be right, not because he was unapproachable, but because she had learned in 7 years that the questions that mattered required the right conditions. You did not ask Torvan Res the things that mattered in a corridor between appointments. You waited until there was time and space for what the question might open. The right moment came 4 weeks after his return. They were in the temple gardens, the inner ones, not the formal meditation terraces, but the smaller, less attended space on the eastern side of the residential quarters, where the plantings were older and the paths were irregular, and it was possible to sit for an extended period without being in anyone's way. She had brought tea. He had brought nothing except his presence, which was substantial. She asked him what it was actually like, not the report, the thing itself. He was quiet for a time that she had learned not to fill. Torvan's silences were not empty. They were the visible surface of thinking that was happening below, and interrupting them was wasteful in the way that interrupting any productive process is wasteful. He said, there were people making decisions about what to sacrifice. They were doing it carefully, thoughtfully, with the appropriate weight given to every consideration. He paused, and I kept thinking, whose consideration was absent from the room, whose weight wasn't being measured because they weren't there to hold it themselves. She thought about this. The people the decisions would affect, she said. The people whose lives were in the arithmetic, he said. Yes, they weren't in the room. They were never going to be in the room. That's not how these rooms work. And the people in the room, they're not villains. They're not indifferent. They genuinely believed that what they were calculating was necessary. And maybe it was necessary. I don't know. I'm not sure the question of whether it was necessary is the most important question. What's the most important question? He looked at the garden for a moment, at a plant near the path whose name Arda didn't know. Something with small leaves, growing low to the ground, very old. The kind of thing that continues without requiring attention. Whether we have confused what we are willing to lose with what we are right to lose, he said. The Order has always made this confusion, I think. I am not sure those are the same thing. I am not sure we have ever seriously examined whether they are. She turned this over. She turned it over for years after, during deployments, during the council's sessions she was later assigned to. She's during the specific, quieter field tents on contested worlds when there was no sleep available and the mind went to the things it kept returning to. She never fully resolved it. She did not think it was meant to be fully resolved. She thought Torvan had given it to her not as a puzzle with a solution, but as a weight she was supposed to learn to carry accurately, to know its shape, to know its mass, to not pretend it wasn't there when it was there. Torvan Res died in the second year of the war. He was deployed to a world in the Tingalarm, a mid-scale engagement, not one of the major campaign theatres, the kind of battle that receives 3 lines in the post-war historical summaries and is remembered primarily by the people who were there, or who lost someone there. Ardeva was not assigned to that world. She was in a field tent on a different world entirely, running the intelligence assessment function for a Republic defensive operation, and the notification came through the standard channel in the standard format that the Republic military uses for these communications, which is a format designed to convey the information clearly and efficiently, and which contains, by design, no language that attempts to do more than convey the information clearly and efficiently. She read it. She acknowledged it. She filed it in the place she filed the things she could not do anything about, which by the second year of the war was a place that was beginning to require significant maintenance to keep from affecting the things she needed to be functional for. She did not meditate that night in any formal sense. She sat in the tent, and she looked at nothing, and she let the weight of it be exactly the weight it was, neither more nor less, neither dramatized nor suppressed. This was what he had taught her. This was the last thing he taught her, from a distance, through his absence. She added his name to the recitation. Not youngest first, he was not a student. She added him at the end, after Sale, after all of them, as a separate category, as the name that preceded whatever came after. She had taught Sale for 2 years, before the war formally began, and continued teaching through the war's first year, in the windows between deployments when she was on Coruscant and the class was still meeting. The class thinned over time. Some students advanced past the level of the morning session. Some were reassigned to other training tracks as the war reshaped the temple's priorities. Some were simply in different places as the logistics of wartime Jedi training became less predictable. But Sile stayed in the class. Sile was there almost every morning that Ardeva was there to teach it. 14 years old, left-handed, held tension in the left shoulder. Not a training problem exactly, more a body's default response to stress, the specific place where Sile's nervous system stored the things it didn't know what else to do with. Ardeva had been correcting this gently for 2 years, not toward the correction's completion, but toward Sile's awareness of it, toward the moment when Sile would feel the shoulder tighten and recognize it as information rather than simply as a physical state, not force exceptional. This was something Ardeva thought about in relation to Sile more than she thought about it in relation to the other students. Because in the other students, it was simply a fact about capability and trajectory, and what kind of Jedi they were going to grow up to be. In Sile, it seemed important in a different way. Important not as a limitation, but as a clarification. Sile's force attunement was real, but not dramatic. Not the kind that announced itself in training exercises, or produced the moments of clear, undeniable demonstration that impressed masters during evaluation periods. What Sile had instead was something quieter and, Ardeva had come to think, more durable. A quality of attention that was directed outward rather than inward. a genuine interest in other people, not performed interest. She not the social competence of a child who has learned that showing interest in others is effective, but actual curiosity about how people worked, what they thought, what they were doing, and why. Sale asked questions the way a person asks questions when the asking is the point rather than the answer. The answers were important, but the asking was primary. The state of inquiry itself, the willingness to not know and to pursue the not knowing, rather than to settle for the nearest available resolution. Ardeva recognized this because Torvan had had it, not as the same quality exactly. Torvan's version of it had been refined over decades into something so integrated it was almost invisible. Sale's version was still visible, still somewhat uneven, still in the process of learning its own shape, but it was the same direction. She is going to be someone worth knowing, Ardeva had thought, watching Sale work through the footwork sequence on the morning described in the first chapter. Not in the future projection sense of considering a Jedi's career trajectory, in the simpler sense of recognizing a particular quality of character, an understanding that character developed over time produces people who make their portion of the world more honest, simply by being present in it. After class, on a morning in the war's first year, Sile had stayed, not the staying to ask of a student with a specific question, but the staying of someone who wanted a different kind of conversation. Ardeva recognized the difference and adjusted accordingly. She sat on the edge of the training room's equipment storage platform, which put her at a lower level than standing, and signaled, without announcing it, that she had time. Sile said, "What does it feel like in the field, actually?" Ardeva considered the question's fullness. "Specific," she said. "Much more specific than the briefings suggest. The briefings are about patterns. The field is about particulars. Every situation has details that don't resemble the model. Do the details change what you decide? Sometimes. The details are why you go in person instead of administering from a distance. If the details never changed anything, you could send a droid." Sile thought about this. But some things don't change, even when the details are different. Some things don't change. Ardeva agreed. The things that are foundational. The things you carry with you and apply to the particulars rather than learn from them. How do you know which is which? She looked at this 14-year-old asking, with the seriousness of someone twice their age, about the epistemology of moral decision-making under pressure, and she felt Torvan's absence very specifically. He would have had a better answer. His answer would have been a question, probably. The question underneath her answer that would have opened it further. She gave the best answer she had. You don't always know in advance. Sometimes you find out which kind of thing it was by what happens after you've treated it as the other kind. That's expensive knowledge. But it doesn't stop being knowledge. Sale sat with this, filed it, moved on to the next question, which was about tactics, specifically about the defensive engagement Ardeva had been involved in the previous deployment, about which the temple's information channels had provided a version Sale had clearly found insufficient. Ardeva answered more specifically than she would have answered most students at this level. She gave the version that was appropriate for a 14-year-old with Sale's quality of attention, which was more complete than the version appropriate for a 14-year-old in general. She edited certain things. She did not simplify the ones that shouldn't be simplified. These conversations continued across the months. On mornings when Ardeva was on Coruscant, Sale stayed after class. They developed, across those mornings, a particular kind of trust. Not the trust of equals, because they were not equals, but the trust of people who have agreed, without stating the agreement, that honesty is what this relationship requires, and that neither of them will insult the other by performing the version of themselves that is easier to present. The morning before Arda's departure for the Alderaan delegation was a morning like the others in surface texture. Same room, same light, same 9 students, or the 8 who remained of the original 9. One had moved to a senior training track in the previous month. She ran the footwork sequence. She moved through corrections. She spent time with the younger students on a basic form they had been developing, watching each one execute it and adjusting what needed adjusting without commentary beyond the specific correction. She spent the last portion of class with Sael on the footwork transition they had been refining since the beginning, the commitment sequence, the full-in, full-out movement that required presence in each position before moving to the next. Sael was better at it now than in the beginning. Not perfect, the left shoulder still carried some of its tension through the transition, a residual habit that required ongoing attention rather than a single correction. But better. The difference was visible and real and represented 2 years of the specific kind of progress that comes from consistent, patient practice, rather than from sudden capability. She corrected the shoulder one more time. The same correction she had given dozens of times, from the same angle, with the same light pressure of her hand to the relevant place. She's indicating the tension rather than forcing the release. Sael felt it and adjusted. For a moment, the shoulder was fully released and the transition was clean. And Arda watched it happen and felt the specific satisfaction of a teacher watching something they have been building take its finished shape. Class ended. The younger students left in their usual patterns. Sael waited. The room was quiet in the way. It was quiet after 8 people left it. The quality of air changed. The acoustic properties different without the bodies that had been absorbing sound. The morning light through the upper windows was moving toward its midday angle. Arda was thinking about the transport she would board in 4 hours, about the Alderaan delegation briefing she had read twice last night and would read once more before departure, about the specific weight of an assignment received and acknowledged in the absence of full information about what the assignment was actually for. She was not thinking about the classroom. She was in the classroom. She was, in Torvan's language, fully present in the room she was in. Sael said, "When do you leave?" "Today," Arda said. "A few hours." Sael looked at the place on the floor where the footwork sequence ended, the endpoint of the transition, the place of full commitment to the second position before returning. "Is it the delegation?" Sael asked. "The Alderaan talks?" She looked at Sael. "It is," she said. She did not ask how Sael knew. She had already established that Sael's attunement expressed itself in knowing things by attention rather than by demonstration. Sael nodded, was quiet for a moment in the way that indicated processing rather than conclusion. Then, "When you come back, will you tell me how it actually goes? Not the version for the briefings, how it actually is." She heard Torvan in this, the question underneath the question, the refusal to accept the version that was easier to give. She heard it and she felt it, and she did not say so, because saying so would have been about her and not about Sael, and this moment was about Sael. She said, "Yes." She meant it completely. She intended to keep the promise in the same way she intended everything she committed to, fully, without reservation, with the understanding that intentions were the beginning of things rather than their completion. She did not know, standing in the morning light of the classroom that had been hers for 7 years, that the promise would join the category of things she filed in the place she kept, the things she could not do anything about. She did not know that Sale was 14 years old and had perhaps 1 year of life remaining, and that the year would end in the lower sections of this same temple. In the sacking, while Ardeva was on Alderaan, reading the room in a conference chamber and doing what she had been sent to do. She did not know any of this. She knew the shoulder and the footwork and the quality of attention in those 14-year-old eyes, and the specific trust of a relationship built across 2 years of honest mornings. She said yes. She meant it. That is the complete record of this moment. The transport was ready at the 4th hour. She walked through the temple's main corridor toward the departure bay, with her kit and her briefing documents and the recitation moving quietly under her breath. Youngest first, Pel, Sarah, Joan, Maret, Devan, Ika, Torith, Rue, Cassel, Sael. All of them complete, all present. She was not memorizing. She was keeping track. The distinction still felt real to her. It would stop feeling real later, when the list was longer, and the weight of what keeping track actually meant had become undeniable. The temple doors opened. She walked through them. They closed. 3 objects. This is not a complete accounting of what Verith Casson carried when he deployed. There was the armor, the weapons, the medical kit, the ration supply, the secondary tools, the communication equipment, all of it standard, all of it issued or personally acquired over years of service, all of it functional and replaceable. The standard objects do not require description. Every soldier in the Imperial Army carried their equivalents. The standard objects were the shared language of military life, common to everyone, distinctive to no one, the material grammar of a profession that required uniformity in order to function. The 3 objects were not standard. They were personal, which in the Imperial Army was not discouraged, but was also not discussed. And you were permitted your personal objects. You were not expected to explain them. The explanation, if it existed, belonged to the interior life, and the interior life was yours, in the way that the kit was the Army's. Privately held, not subject to inspection, acknowledged as existing without its contents being required. The first object was the history text. Republic Agricultural History, Outer Rim Edition, covering the growing cycles and land management practices of 6 inhabited systems across a period of approximately 200 standard years. He had found it in a crate of miscellaneous captured archive material during his first deployment. Material that had been flagged as non-classified, non-strategic, suitable for disposal or secondary use. He had picked it up because he had finished the 2 texts he had brought with him and had 3 weeks remaining in the deployment and nothing else available to read. He had read it in the way you read something you did not choose, without investment, without expectation, covering the pages because the alternative was to cover nothing. And somewhere in the 3rd chapter, in a section describing the way Twi'lek agricultural communities on Ryloth organized their planting calendars around the specific geological rhythms of their world, the thermal cycles, the shifting of usable soil composition across seasons, the community decision-making processes that determined which fields were used when. He had stopped reading in the passive covering pages way and had started reading in the other way. The other way was the way he read things that mattered. Slowly, with attention to what the text was actually doing beneath what it appeared to be doing, what the Ryloth Agricultural Survey was doing beneath its surface function as a record of farming practices, was describing a civilization that had organized itself entirely around the specific conditions of the world it lived on, not imposing a structure from outside, but developing one from within, from the particular requirements of that soil, that light, that community. It was a description of people living in actual relationship with their circumstances rather than in resistance to them. He had read this and felt with the specific clarity of recognition that this was the thing he had been trying to understand for years without having a clear name for it. And he did not agree with everything the Republic represented. That was not the point. The point was that the text was honest. It was describing something real. It was not constructed to prove a position or support an argument. It was simply recording what happened on a particular world over a particular period, with the care that genuine attention produces when it is not bent toward a conclusion in advance. He brought the text on every deployment after the first. It was worn now, the spines softened from handling, the cover edges rounded where they had met the corners of kit bags and equipment crates across years of transit. He had read it completely 3 times, and partially many more. He knew certain passages, the way you know things you have returned to, often enough that they have become part of the furniture of the mind, present without requiring retrieval, available when you needed them without needing to be sought. He placed it in the kit beneath the spare uniform, where it always went, where it fit exactly. The second object was a piece of cloth. It had belonged to his uncle Varek, who had died in a border skirmish when Verith was 11 years old. The cloth was not ceremonially significant. It was not a relic in any meaningful sense, not connected to his uncle's service record, not something that had been with Varek at the moment of his death, not anything that the Imperial Army's tradition of honoring fallen soldiers would have designated as meaningful. It was a piece of cloth from a jacket his uncle had worn when he was not in uniform. A civilian garment, dark blue, made of something that had softened over years of wearing into the specific texture of fabric that has been washed and worn and washed again until it has become entirely itself, entirely broken in, entirely the thing it is rather than the thing it started as. Verith had found it in the apartment after his uncle's death, in the way that a child finds things without intention, during the process of the adults around him, doing what adults do in the aftermath of a death, which requires movement through rooms and handling of objects, and the slow, difficult work of deciding what a person's things mean, now that the person is not there to give them meaning. He had taken the cloth without asking. Not stolen, taken, in the way that a child takes something because the taking is a form of keeping, because the object holds something of the person, and having the object is one available strategy for not losing the person entirely. He was not sentimental about this. He would have said he was not sentimental about this. He would have been mostly right. The cloth was not a comfort object in the way the word implies softness and dependency. It was more like a calibration tool, a physical object connected to a specific truth about what he was doing and why he had agreed to do it. His uncle had been a soldier. His uncle had died in service. The cloth was the thing that remained of the person, and keeping it was the thing Verith did to maintain the connection between the abstract concept of service and the specific reality of a person he had known, who had been real and alive, and who was then not real and not alive in the specific way that only death achieves. He did not take it out and handle it. He did not perform any ritual with it. It sat in the kit beneath the spare uniform beside the history text, and it was there, which was sufficient. Sufficient was the right word. Not more than sufficient, not less. The third object was the list. It was written in a small notebook, not a data pad, not a digital record. Paper. Physical paper, which in this era was available but not common. A deliberate choice rather than a default. He had started it in a paper notebook because the physical act of writing had seemed important. The pressure of the stylus, the permanence of ink on paper, the way a written name occupied space differently than a digital entry. A digital entry could be deleted. A paper record could be destroyed, but not without an act that acknowledged the destruction. The distinction mattered to him, without his being fully able to articulate why it mattered. He had begun the list after the third death, not the first, not the second, the third. The first death had been handled by the Army's institutional processes, the notification, the filing, the movement forward that the organization required, and that Verith had participated in, because participating was what you did. The second had been handled the same way. He had not been numb to either of them. He had felt both. He had processed both in the way the Army's culture processed such things, with the forward-facing acknowledgement that loss was a component of the profession, that the profession required continuation regardless, that the best response to loss in the field was functional competence. He had been functionally competent. He had continued. The third death was a soldier named Harrick, 20 years old, in the unit for 8 months. Reliably competent, quiet in the specific way of people whose quietness is a personality trait rather than a mood. Harrick had been there at morning formation and had not been at afternoon assignment briefing, and the gap between those two states was so small and so complete. 4 hours, a border engagement, a piece of equipment failure at the wrong moment, that Verith had stood at the afternoon briefing, looking at the space where Harrick would have stood, and felt the gap as a physical thing, as if the air itself had been rearranged around the absence and had not settled back into its previous configuration. He had started the list that night. He wrote Harrick first, then went back and wrote the first and second, then left space for what would come after, because he knew there would be what would come after. The list had grown. He carried the notebook in his kit in the same place every deployment. He said the names from it regularly, in order from the beginning, without skipping, the way you read a text that is meant to be read completely rather than sampled. Not as a ritual exactly, not with ceremony, simply as the thing he did to maintain the connection between the names and the people the names had been, to prevent the list from becoming a list of words rather than a list of people. He said the names under his breath while he checked manifests. The two rhythms ran together without interfering. This was a thing he had not decided to develop. It had developed over time from the repetition. The manifests were daily, the names were daily. The pairing had eventually become natural in the way that two activities practiced simultaneously. Long enough, eventually become one activity with two components. He sealed the kit. He did not look around the apartment. He had already looked. He left. Dos Carath had been in the Imperial Army for 12 years when Verith was assigned to her unit, which meant she had been in the army for longer than some of her current squad mates had been adults. She wore this not as authority exactly. Her rank conferred authority, and she used it the way competent officers use it, which is efficiently and without theatre, but as a quality of perspective that was different from what the younger soldiers had. She had seen enough cycles of the army's patterns to know which things were genuinely variable and which things only appeared to be. She was from the outer settlements of Drome and Kars, the less central districts, the ones that had been built later and less carefully, where the city's infrastructure thinned into something that functioned, but that had never been given the same quality of attention as the areas closer to the Imperial Administrative Center. She had joined the army at 18 because it was the best available option from the ones she had been given. which was not the same as it being a good option in any absolute sense. She knew this. She had never described it any other way. She found Verith strange in the specific way that competent, straightforward people find other people strange when those other people are doing something that seems to require more effort than it should. The history texts were the primary source of the strangeness. She had encountered the reading habit early in their unit assignment, when she had found him with the agricultural survey during a transit period and had asked, with genuine rather than performative curiosity, what he was reading and why. He had shown her the cover. She had read the title. She had looked at him for a moment with the expression she wore when she was recalibrating her model of something. Republic Agricultural History, she had said. Yes, from the Outer Rim, from 6 systems, primarily Ryloth. She had handed it back. You could have a lot of different things to read, she said. You chose that. I've read it 3 times, he said. 3 times, she said. Not a question, a notation. She filed it in the place she filed things that were true about Verith, and that she did not fully understand, but that were clearly not problems. The reading was not a problem. It was just strange. Strange things that were not problems were, in DOS's economy of attention, allocated a small space and not revisited unless they became problems. The reading never became a problem. She revisited it occasionally anyway, because it was genuinely curious to her. Not troubling, just curious. What do you get from it? She had asked him once, later, during a longer transit. 3 times. What keeps being there? He had thought about this with the seriousness he gave all questions that deserved it, which was one of the other things about him she had filed under strange, but not a problem. Honesty, he said finally. It's not trying to be anything except what it is. It's just recording what happened on a world, what people did to survive on a world, without a position. Everything has a position, she said. Not always. Sometimes something is just a record. Records are made by someone, she said. Someone decided what to record and what not to record and how to describe what they recorded. That's a position even when it doesn't feel like one. He had looked at her with the expression he wore when she had said something that required genuine processing. That's true, he said. I haven't resolved that. You don't need to resolve it, she said. You just need to know it's there. This was, more or less, the register of their conversations, disagreeing about something that didn't change anything between them, returning to the same disagreements occasionally without resolving them, finding in the pattern of return itself a kind of comfort that neither of them would have named as comfort, but that functioned as such. She knew him in this way, more clearly than most people knew him. She knew what he did, how he worked, what he reached for under pressure. She did not know his interior life because he had not told her his interior life, and she had not asked. The asking was not her way. The observing was. She knew about the list. She had seen him with it. She had not asked what was in it. She knew it was names. She had seen enough of the notebook's open pages at sufficient distance to register that the content was text in list format. She did not need to be told the specifics to understand the function. The troop bay of the transit vessel was dark, in the way that troop bays are dark during long transit. Not the darkness of lightlessness, but the dim darkness of a space where some people are sleeping and the lighting has been reduced to accommodate them, where the remaining light comes from equipment panels and the occasional personal device and the faint structural glow of the ship's running systems. It smelled of the specific combination that troop bays always smelled of: recycled air, equipment oil, the biological presence of many people in an enclosed space for an extended period. Not unpleasant after sufficient exposure, just the smell of transit, the smell of between. Verith was not sleeping. He was doing what he did in transit when sleep was not available. Lying with his eyes open in the direction of the overhead, thinking with the quality of attention that long, dark transit periods produce, which is different from the attention of active operations, more discursive, less controlled. The mind moves through its own material in whatever order it chooses, rather than in the order the situation requires. Doss was in the adjacent bunk. He could tell she was not sleeping either. Her breathing did not have the rhythm of sleep, and she had been still in the particular way of deliberate stillness, rather than the settled way of someone genuinely at rest. She said in the darkness, in the register of the troop bay at night, "Do you think the people who started this know what they're asking us to finish?" He turned his head toward her in the dark. He could not see her face clearly. He did not need to see her face to know she was asking seriously. The question had weight, the specific weight of something that had been carried for a while before being spoken. She said, I'm not asking rhetorically. I want to know what you think." He was quiet. He looked at the overhead again. He thought about the fleet rising from the staging world. He thought about the briefing officer and the word reclaimed and the institutional weight of it, the way it was designed to do work beyond description. He thought about the history text and the Ryloth agricultural calendar and the people in it who had organized their lives around the conditions of their specific world. He thought about his uncle's cloth in the kit and the list in the notebook and the names he had said this morning before boarding from the beginning in order. He thought for a long time. The hull made its hyperspace sound, the low structural complaint of materials under pressure, the sound of going faster than things were meant to go. He was still thinking when the ship dropped out of hyperspace. The humming began. The city Arda returned to was the same city in the way that a scar is the same skin. The coordinates were identical. The streets that had not been destroyed still ran between the same buildings they had always run between. The founder-tide quarters' lower corridors still connected to the Senate Plaza by the same route she had walked every morning for 7 years. The fountain at the junction of 2 corridors was still running. She did not go to see it on the first day, but she knew it was running, the way you know the condition of things you have been present with, long enough that their continued existence feels like a law rather than a contingency. She knew it was running, and she did not go to see it because the fountain was ordinary, and she was not ready yet for ordinary things. She was not sure ordinary things were available to her in the same way anymore. She was not sure the category still existed in the form she had known it. She had been on Alderaan when it happened. This is the sentence she could not stop constructing and reconstructing in the days between the sacking and her return to Coruscant. Not as self-accusation. The assignment had been real. The delegation had been real. The orders had come from the Council, and the Council had received them from the strategic situation. And the strategic situation had not been fully visible to anyone in the delegation room on Alderaan, including her. She knew this. She reviewed it, and it remained true on each reviewing. She had been on Alderaan. She had been following orders. She had been doing what she had been told was necessary. The sentence kept constructing itself anyway, not as accusation, as fact. The specific, irreducible fact of her location at the moment the temple was burning. The geographical certainty of her absence from the place she had spent 7 years learning to consider home. She landed at a secondary Republic transit point on Coruscant's upper levels, which had been established in the days after the sacking to manage the volume of returning military and Jedi personnel without routing them through the main landing infrastructure, which was still being assessed for structural integrity. The transit point was functional and stripped of everything non-essential: a landing pad, a processing station, a corridor leading to the transit network. She processed through it with her kit and her delegation documents and nothing else, and she entered the city. The upper levels looked, at first approach, largely intact. The sacking had been a targeted operation. The Sith fleet had not attempted a full planetary bombardment, had not moved to destroy Coruscant as a functioning city. They had moved to demonstrate that they could reach it, that the Republic's seat of government was not protected from them, that whatever the Republic believed about its own security was insufficient. The demonstration had not required destroying everything. It had required destroying enough. The temple, sections of the lower governmental district, specific infrastructure chosen to be maximally visible, chosen, it was clear to anyone reading the strategic logic, by people who understood that the political damage of the sacking would be proportional to what it showed rather than what it destroyed. She took the transit line toward the temple district. The damage became visible as she descended levels, not catastrophic at the upper transition. A building on the fourth intersection with its upper floors sheared away, the wound clean and specific in the manner of precision ordnance rather than indiscriminate bombardment. Workers already clearing the debris below, the sound of it carrying up through the transit station's open ventilation panels. Then more, then more. By the time she transferred to the lower line toward the temple plaza, she was looking at the city she had walked every morning for 7 years and finding it altered in the specific way of something that has been changed at a cellular level. The substance still present, but the arrangement different. The relationships between things shifted in ways that would require years to fully inventory. She walked from the lower transit station to the temple on foot. The temple was standing. This was the first and most important thing. It was standing, the main structure intact, the 5 spires present in the skyline in the configuration she had memorized years ago, and never thought to memorize, because memorizing the skyline had not seemed necessary. The temple was standing. Large sections of it were intact, and sections were not. The lower eastern wing, the residential quarters for the youngest students, the training rooms for the junior classes, the archive access corridor that connected the main structure to the deep archive levels was heavily damaged, not destroyed, damaged. The distinction between destroyed and damaged, she would come to understand in the following days, was one of the most exhausting distinctions of the aftermath period, because damaged implied something that could be addressed, and the addressing would take a very long time, and the time would pass in proximity to the evidence of what had happened, and there was no way to not be inside that proximity while the work was done. She walked through the temple without speaking to anyone, not because there was no one. The temple was occupied, the surviving masters and knights and support staff present, and engaged in the initial phases of assessment and stabilization, and the administrative work of accounting for who was present and who was not. She passed people she knew in corridors, and she nodded and they nodded, and the specific understanding between people who have all received the same information and are still in the early stage of processing it, made conversation unnecessary, and she did not stop. She went to the classroom. The eastern training wing was intact. The section of the lower eastern residential quarter that connected to it was not intact, but the training wing itself had been spared. The damage stopping, with the arbitrary specificity of ordnance, approximately 30 meters from the wing's exterior wall. The wall was there. The door was there. She opened it. The room was the same. The floor surface she had spent 7 years teaching footwork sequences on was unmarked. The equipment storage platform along the western wall was undisturbed. The upper windows that let in the morning light at the angle she had organized her teaching practice around were intact. The room was exactly what it had always been. The right proportions, the right dimensions, the acoustic properties she had learned to use without thinking about using them. The room did not know what had happened. It had simply remained while the things around it changed, the way some things remain without choosing to. She stood in the center of the room. She looked at the place where Sael would stand, at the back of the group, slightly to the right, with the particular stance of someone who was present and attentive and not performing either. The place was empty in the specific way of a place where a person always stood that the person is not currently occupying. She looked at it. She let herself look at it without moving away from what she saw. She looked at the places where all of them would stand. Pell at the front, slightly left. Sarah beside him. Joan and Marit in the second row in their respective positions. Joan with the physical precision already visible in how he held himself even at rest. Marit with the slightly open quality of someone whose attunement was receiving more than it was projecting. Devan, Ika, Toreth in the third row. Rue and Castle in their habitual proximity. Sael at the back. The room was empty. She began to recite names. Youngest first. Pell. She said the name in the room that had held him and said it with the full weight of the practice, not the weight of ceremony or grief's performance, but the weight of refusal. Refusal to allow the absence to become abstraction. He had been here. He had been 9 years old and small for his age, and very serious about the work of training, and he had been here in this room, in this light, on many mornings, and that was a fact she was going to continue to hold as a fact regardless of what status the army's or the Order's accounting system assigned to his name. Sarah, Joan, Maret, Davan, Ika, Toreth, Rue, Castle, Sael. She said each name in the room, and each name occupied the room in the way that names occupy spaces where the person lived. Briefly, incompletely, but really. She did not know, standing in the classroom, which of these names she would not say again, because the person was gone. She did not yet have the complete information. The accounting was still ongoing. She said all of them because all of them were still on the list as she held it, and she would hold them there until she was given a reason to hold them differently. She did not weep, not because she was incapable of it, because the thing she was doing was not weeping's work. Weeping was for after you had processed the loss into its full shape. She was not there yet. She was at the stage before that, the stage of insisting on specificity, on names, on faces, on the particular grip correction and the particular footwork sequence, and the particular quality of a 14-year-old's attentiveness in a doorway. On the specific texture of what was there before, she could be asked to begin the work of accounting for its absence. She said all the names. Then she added Torvund's at the end in his separate category. Then she stood in the silence of the room that had been her room, and she let the silence be what it was. On a mid-rim world that the official Imperial campaign records listed as Objective 12, Verith Casson walked a courtyard. The installation had been a Republic defensive position, a supply and communication hub for a cluster of mid-rim operations, positioned at a geographic choke point that both sides had correctly identified as strategically significant. The Republic had held it for 11 days after his unit arrived in the sector. 11 days was longer than his commanding officer had projected. The soldiers who held it for 11 days had done so with the specific quality of effort that comes from fighting for something you believe is the last thing between you and something worse. They had held it, and then they had not held it, and the installation was now in Imperial hands, and the courtyard was what it was. He walked it in the manner of a post-engagement assessment. This was his function: accounting, assessment, the inventory of what the battle had left. He had done this before. He had learned to do it with the professional attention that the function required, which meant seeing clearly without the seeing, becoming something that interrupted the function. You looked at what was there. You recorded what was there. You reported what was there. The seeing and the recording and the reporting were the job, and the job needed to be done cleanly. The courtyard held the dead of both sides. They were lying in the arrangement that combat leaves, which is not an arrangement at all, but an absence of arrangement. The positions that bodies occupy when the fighting stops exactly where it stops, with no retrospective organization, no placement that acknowledges anything about who the people were, or what they had believed, or what they had been fighting for, or what they had left behind. The arrangement of the dead in a courtyard after a battle is the most complete available evidence that combat has no relationship with meaning. It ends where it ends. The people end where they end. The positions are simply the positions. He walked the courtyard and he did his assessment. He noted numbers, positions, the distribution of unit markings on the Imperial dead that would allow him to route the notification process correctly. He noted the building damage, the structural assessments required for the installation's intended occupation, the infrastructure that would need attention before the installation could serve its new function. He did this efficiently. He did it with the clean professionalism that Doss had said once was one of the things she trusted about him. Not that he was cold, she had said, but that he was capable of doing the work that needed doing, without the work doing something to him that would stop him from doing it again tomorrow. He was 3/4 through the courtyard when he heard himself saying names. He had not decided to do it. He had not reached a point in the assessment where names seemed appropriate or relevant. He simply noticed that he was doing it, that somewhere in the process of moving through the courtyard and looking at what was there, the other practice had begun in parallel. The way it ran in parallel with manifest checks, the way it apparently ran in parallel with whatever he was doing if the practice decided it needed to run. See the names of his own dead, his list, from the beginning, in order. He did not stop. He let the practice run while the assessment ran. Both rhythms continuing simultaneously in the same body moving through the same courtyard. He had no explanation for why this was happening here, in this specific aftermath, on this specific world. Perhaps it was the scale of what the courtyard contained. Perhaps it was the proximity of the dead of both sides in the same space without organization or distinction. Perhaps it was simply that the practice was old enough now and established enough that it ran when certain conditions were present, and this was those conditions. He said all the names. He reached the end of the list, the most recent additions, the names from the last engagement before this one, said in the courtyard of this one. Then the assessment was complete. He stood at the installation's northern perimeter, and he looked back at what the courtyard held, and he filed his report in his mind in the language of assessments, numbers, positions, structural conditions, required actions. He did not file it in any other language. That was not what was required of him here. Somewhere in the Lower Eastern section of the Jedi Temple, on Coruscant, in the archive access corridor that ran between the training wing and the deep archive levels, a pipe had broken in the bombardment. It had broken 3 days ago. The section of the temple it occupied had not yet been reached by the recovery teams moving through the building's damaged portions in systematic sequence, working from the most critical structural damage outward toward the peripheral areas. The archive access corridor was not the most critical structural damage. It was peripheral, scheduled, waiting for the teams to reach it in the order the assessment had established. The water ran. It ran from the broken pipe into the corridor floor, which had been covered before the bombardment in a material that was now partially compromised, cracked in a pattern that followed the structural stress of the blast that had damaged the corridor, spread unevenly across the floor's surface in the specific geometry of damage-absorbing force and distributing it along lines of least resistance. The water followed the cracks. It found the lowest point in the corridor's floor, and it ran toward it, carrying with it the dust of what the bombardment had reduced, fragments of the archive materials that had been housed in the section, fragments of the corridor's own structure, the fine particulate matter that a building produces when it is struck by something it was not built to withstand. The water ran into the dust of what had been there before. It disappeared. It had been doing this for 3 days. It would continue doing it until the recovery teams reached the corridor and repaired the pipe and the water stopped. Until then, it ran. In the silence of the unoccupied section, in the dark of a corridor, where the lighting systems had failed with everything else, it ran and disappeared, and ran and disappeared. In the way of things that continue simply because the conditions for their continuation have not yet been removed. Nobody heard it. The classroom was 30 meters away, and Arda had already left it. The fountain in the Founder-Tide Quarter was running in the corridor junction 2 kilometers to the southwest, and it was not aware of the pipe. The water ran. This is not a battle. It does not have a battle's architecture. No strategic objective, no opposing commanders, no line of engagement that can be drawn on a map and studied afterward for what it reveals about the decisions of the people who drew it. It does not have a victory. It does not have a defeat. It has a redirect order and a convoy and a landing zone and what the landing zone contained when the convoy arrived. That is the complete available structure. Everything else, the decision that preceded the redirect order, the knowledge or absence of knowledge in the room where the order was made, the specific weight of each life inside the 3,400 that the arithmetic contained, is either absent from the record or present in a form so contradicted by competing accounts that the record itself constitutes evidence only of its own incompleteness. The narrator does not have a position on what follows. The narrator has only what the accounts agree on, which is not much, and what the accounts do not agree on, which is nearly everything, and the silence underneath all of it, which is the one thing all available sources share completely. The convoy was designated RC Evac 7 in the Republic military's operational records for the 4th year of the war. It was a civilian resettlement operation, standard in form, one of approximately 40 such operations conducted in that year alone, in response to the displacement of civilian populations from active combat zones across the Mid-Rim. The Republic's civilian protection mandate required that populations in direct combat zones be moved to designated safe areas when military operations made their continued presence in the combat zone untenable. The mandate was real. The operations it generated were real. 40 such operations in a single year across multiple theaters represented a logistical commitment of considerable scale. Transport vessels, personnel, coordination with ground operations, route planning through combat corridors that were themselves subject to change on short notice. RC Evac 7 carried 3,400 people. The figure is not approximate. It is the figure recorded in the convoy's own manifest, filed at the operation's point of origin on a mid-rim world, whose name appears in the operational record, but not in any of the war's major histories. 3,400. The manifest listed them in the categories that manifests use: adults, children, individuals requiring medical support, individuals requiring mobility assistance. The categories were filled with numbers. The numbers were filled with people. This is the relationship between administrative categories and human beings that exists in the records of all large organizations managing large populations during periods of crisis. And it is a relationship that the records themselves are not designed to make visible. The manifest was a manifest. It did what manifests do. The convoy's original route had been planned through the planet's northern corridor, a transit path that had been assessed as sufficiently clear of active operations to permit safe passage. The assessment had been conducted 36 hours before departure. 36 hours was the standard assessment window. The standard assessment window had been established at a time when combat corridor conditions changed on a cycle that made 36 hours a reasonable window. By the 4th year of the war, combat corridor conditions on contested mid-rim worlds were changing on a cycle that made 36 hours something closer to a guess with documentation. The redirect order came from Regional Command Node 7. It came 6 hours into the convoy's transit. When the convoy was committed to the route, past the point where returning to the origin point was the simpler option, at the specific stage of the journey where a redirect required the convoy to move forward into an alternative rather than backward into the known. The stated reason in the order's text was tactical necessity. The northern corridor had been reclassified as an active combat zone. Alternative routing was required. The order specified the secondary landing zone on the planet's southern continent as the redirect destination. The order did not specify what was present at the secondary landing zone. It specified the coordinates. The redirect order was signed by a command authority whose designation appears in the Regional Command Node's operational log. The name attached to that designation does not appear in any post-war record accessible to the Republic Archivist's office. Whether this is because the name was removed from accessible records, or because the records containing it were among those destroyed during the sacking of Coruscant, or because the designation was a functional one that was never attached to a specific individual's permanent file, is not known. 3 accounts exist that describe what happened after the convoy reached the secondary landing zone. The first account is from a convoy crew member, a transport pilot designated only as Crew 1 Evac 7 Survivor, account filed at Medical Station, 4th year, in the Republic's post-war civilian testimony archive. The account is 3 paragraphs long. Choose the first paragraph describes the redirect order and the convoy's response to it. The second paragraph describes the approach to the secondary landing zone and the first indication, visible from the transport's forward sensors, that the landing zone was not what the redirect order had implied it would be. The third paragraph begins with the words, "when we understood what we were landing into," and ends 6 words later. The remaining space on the document is blank. Whether the account was interrupted or whether the pilot stopped at that point by choice is not recorded. The second account is from a Republic military logistician who kept personal records throughout the 4th year of the war, a habit that was not prohibited but was not standard, and that produced a document which was found in a personal effects collection filed after the logistician's death at the war's end from causes unrelated to combat. The logistician was not present at the secondary landing zone. The logistician was present at Regional Command Node 7 at the time the redirect order was issued. The account describes a conversation the logistician overheard, partially through a partition without full context, between two command staff members in the hours before the redirect order was filed. The account does not transcribe the conversation. It says only that the conversation occurred, that it involved the Northern Corridor's reclassification and the secondary landing zone, and that after it ended, one of the command staff members spent a long time standing at the node's exterior viewport, looking at nothing before returning to their station. The logistician did not know the significance of what they had overheard until after the convoy had reached its destination. They wrote it down then. They did not report it through any official channel. They kept it in a personal record for the remaining years of the war, and did not speak of it to anyone who appears in any other document. The third and fourth accounts, there were two Imperial accounts, not one as initially noted in the summaries, were filed as standard after-action reports by Sith Imperial infantry soldiers assigned to the ground operation in the secondary landing zone sector. After-action reports from Imperial ground operations are standardized documents. Engagement description, casualty accounting, objective status, notable conditions. Both reports noted, in the section designated for notable conditions, the presence of civilian transport vessels at the landing zone during the operation's active phase. Both reports noted the civilian population in the landing zone. Both reports filed the engagement as completed and the objective as achieved. Neither report included any notation that the presence of civilian transport vessels at the landing zone was unexpected, or that any communication was initiated with the convoy prior to or during the engagement, or that the operational parameters were modified in response to what the landing zone contained when the convoy arrived. Both reports were filed in the standard Imperial Operational Archive. Both were subsequently reclassified. The reclassification authorization appears in the archive's access log without explanation. The reports themselves are not accessible in any archive that responded to post-war inquiries. What happened in the gap between the redirect order and the landing is not something either archive preserves. 3 accounts exist, 2 Imperial, 1 Republic. They agree on nothing except the silence that followed. The silence that followed was not a negotiated silence. It was not the product of a decision made in a room by people who agreed that silence was what was required. It was the silence that forms when no one, on either side, she has a language for what happened that they are willing to speak in public. When the event exists outside the categories that official records are designed to contain, when both the perpetrating context and the witnessing context find, independently, that the available languages do not fit. The Republic had a language for civilian casualties in combat zones. It was the language of regrettable necessity and tactical complexity, and the tragedy inherent in warfare. The language required that the casualties be legibly connected to military operations conducted in good faith that produced unintended consequences. The redirect order complicated the good faith. The Republic's language did not accommodate complicated good faith. It became silence. The Sith Empire had a language for civilian casualties. It was the language of operational necessity and the costs of reclamation, and the Republic's responsibility for placing its civilians in combat corridors. This language required that the Imperial operation be responding to a situation rather than creating one. The after-action report's notation of civilian transport presence at the landing zone complicated the responding to a situation framing. The Sith Empire's language did not accommodate this complication. The reports were reclassified. It became silence. The convoy crew member stopped writing at when we understood what we were landing into. The logistician kept a private record and showed it to no one. The Imperial soldiers filed their reports and moved to the next engagement. The 3,400 people in the convoy's manifest are not in any post-war accounting of war dead that either side compiled. They are in the manifest. They are nowhere else in any record that either side chose to preserve. Whether any of them survived, in what numbers, under what conditions, is not documented in any source that responded to the inquiry that produced this account. The narrator does not know what the right word for this is. The narrator does not have a position on whose failure this was, or whether failure is the correct category, or whether the categories available are sufficient for what the secondary landing zone on an unnamed mid-rim world's southern continent contained on the day the redirect order sent 3,400 people into it. The narrator has the manifest number. The narrator has the 3 accounts and their silences. The narrator has the reclassification notice in an archive access log and a logistician's private record and 6 words at the end of a 3-paragraph testimony. The narrator has the silence. It was not a small silence. It was not a silence that fit neatly into the spaces between the war's louder events. It was the kind of silence that occupies the same volume as the thing it is covering. The kind that, if you are standing near it and you are still enough, you can feel the shape of what is underneath it by the way the air around it behaves. Both sides felt it. Neither side named it. The war continued. The committee met in a room on the Senate building's 14th level, not the chambers where votes were cast and recorded and entered into the Republic's official legislative history. Those chambers were large, designed for visibility, built with the architecture of accountability in mind. The tiered seating, the central podium, the gallery where citizens could observe their government performing its functions in the light. The 14th level was not that. The 14th level was where the work happened that the larger chambers voted on without fully understanding, in rooms sized for function rather than visibility, with the kind of lighting that suggested permanence and the kind of ventilation that suggested the people in these rooms were expected to stay in them for extended periods. The committee room had a long table. It had chairs that were more comfortable than they appeared. It had a viewport that looked onto an internal corridor rather than the city outside, which meant that the people in it were not distracted by the evidence of the world their decisions affected. Arda had been assigned to the Joint Jedi Senate Intelligence Committee in the war's 5th year. The assignment had come through the Council. A request from the Senate's strategic oversight body, routed through the appropriate channels, framed as a request for Jedi analytical support on matters of combined military and political intelligence. She had not requested it. She had accepted it the way she accepted assignments that came through proper channels, from authorities she recognized as legitimate, completely, with the professional cooperation that the assignment required, and with the part of her that read rooms already reading this one before she had sat in it for the first session. She had understood within the first 2 sessions what she was actually there for. She was there because she was good at reading rooms, and the people in the Senate who knew she was good at reading rooms had decided that a Jedi who was good at reading rooms was useful in a context where reading rooms was the primary survival skill. The committee's stated function was intelligence assessment, the aggregation and analysis of military and political intelligence from multiple sources to inform strategic decision-making at the Senate level. This function was real and was performed. It was also, she came to understand, not the primary thing the room was for. The primary thing the room was for was the management of information. specifically the management of which information reached which people, in which form, at which time. The intelligence was real. The assessment was real. The management of what the assessment meant for the people who received it was where the actual work happened, and that work was not listed in the committee's mandate. She sat in the sessions, and she listened, and she read the room. The room was full of people who were competent. This was important to understand first, because the alternative explanation, that the outcomes she was witnessing were the product of incompetence or indifference, was simpler and would have been, in some ways, easier to carry. Incompetence produced bad outcomes through the absence of understanding. What she was watching was not the absence of understanding. The people in the committee room understood the information they were managing. They understood it clearly and specifically, and with the full weight of their considerable experience. What they were doing with that understanding was not the product of failing to comprehend it. It was the product of having decided, somewhere prior to this room and prior to these sessions, what the information was allowed to mean. The supply route vote occurred in the committee's 4th month. The intelligence assessment was straightforward. 3 Republic outposts in the Outer Rim were operating at reduced supply capacity due to a disruption in their primary resupply corridor. The disruption was the result of Imperial interdiction activity, standard operational pressure, the kind that the Imperial campaign had been applying systematically across Outer Rim supply lines for the past 18 months. The assessment identified a secondary route that could restore adequate supply to all 3 outposts within a 2-week implementation window. The secondary route required authorization because it passed through a sector with active trade agreements that had security implications for several core world commercial interests. The vote on the route authorization was not close. She watched a senator from a core world. She noted the affiliation, noted the district, noted the commercial interests that the district contained. Vote against the authorization. She watched him do this with the specific quality of attention she brought to everything in this room, which meant she watched not just the vote, but the preparation for it. The conversation in the corridor before the session, the notes reviewed at the table's edge, the moment when the vote was called, and the senator's face arranged itself into the expression of someone performing a difficult decision that had actually been made before the session began. The outposts were entered in the vote summary as strategic positions, reinforcement status, deferred. She filed her intelligence assessment for the committee. It covered the route analysis, the supply projections, the operational risk assessment for the 3 outposts under continued supply reduction. She wrote it with the precision the function required. She submitted it through the proper channel. It was received and logged and entered into the committee's records. 3 weeks later, 2 of the 3 outposts were overrun. The committee received the operational reports. The reports were discussed in the session following their receipt. The language of the discussion was the language of the room: strategic complexity, resource prioritization, the regrettable but inevitable costs of managing a multi-theater conflict with finite assets. The 2 overrun outposts were mentioned by their designation numbers. They were not mentioned by the number of people who had been in them. That number existed in a different document, in a different section of the military's record-keeping system, in the part where the people numbers lived separately from the strategic designation numbers in the specific way of large organizations that have found it more functional to keep those categories from contaminating each other. She returned to her quarters after that session, and she sat down. She sat in the stillness that comes not from peace, but from the complete exhaustion of the mechanism that produces alternatives. She had been, for 5 years, a person who received information and acted on it. who took the understanding of a situation and converted it into action, because action was what her training had built her for, because the Jedi framework she had been given was a framework for response. She had been good at this. She had been, within the considerable constraints of the war, effective. She had done things that mattered in the field, in the specific situations where a Jedi's presence and capability made a genuine difference. She sat in her quarters and she understood, with the completeness of something that had been approaching for a long time and had now arrived, that the field was not where the decisions were made. The field was where the decisions arrived. The decisions were made in rooms like the one on the 14th level, by people whose relationship to the field was administrative, who received the field's information in the filtered form that the management of information produced, and who made calculations that went back to the field as orders, and who were not in the field when the orders arrived, and the arriving cost what it cost. She was in both places. She had been in the field, and she was in the committee room. She was, uniquely, and at some cost to herself that she was still calculating, a person who understood both sides of the distance between them. She did not know what to do with this understanding. There was nothing obvious to do with it. She could not report it. It was not a violation of protocol. It was not an intelligence failure. It was the machinery working as it was built to work, which was the most exhausting possible discovery. You cannot file a report about the machinery. The machinery is what processes the reports. She began to recite names. Youngest first. Pell. Sarah. Joan. Marit. She got to Darvin and stopped. Darvin was among the names she had added after the sacking. She had received the confirmation 3 weeks after she had stood in the classroom, saying the names she was not sure she still had the right to say. The complete accounting that the Order's recovery teams had finally assembled from the temple's damaged sections. The list of students and personnel whose status had been unconfirmed and was now confirmed in the specific and permanent way that confirmed in that direction always is. Davon, 12 years old, 3rd row, center, had been working on the form correction for 4 months. She had added the name to the list. She had been adding it ever since. But there was a difference between adding a name to the list and being ready to say it. And in the specific stillness of this specific evening, having sat in the committee room and watched the vote and filed her assessment and received the operational reports, she understood that she had not been ready to say it. Not yet. Not in this state. She stopped. She sat with the incomplete recitation. She did not finish it that night. Verith's promotion came in the war's 5th year. She in a document delivered by a logistics officer who handed it to him with the slightly apologetic expression of someone who is aware that what they are delivering is not a reward. It was not a reward. 3 officers senior to him in the unit's chain of command had been killed in the preceding 8 months. Not together, in separate engagements on separate worlds, through the accumulated attrition that the 5th year of the war was producing across the Imperial Army's officer ranks with the steady and unspectacular efficiency of a system working exactly as systems work when they have been running longer than their initial resource projections anticipated. The promotion was a gap being filled. He was the available qualified person for the gap. The promotion document said this in the language that promotion documents use, which converted the attrition into a recognition of capability and the gap filling into an advancement. The language was not dishonest exactly. It was optimistic about its own framing. The new rank came with access to operational planning documents. He read them. He read them with the patience he had developed over years of reading things that were not written for him. The captured archive patience. the attention to what a text was actually doing, beneath what it appeared to be doing, the habit of holding contradictions in parallel without resolving them prematurely. He read the operational planning documents the way he had read the Republic Agricultural Survey. Not for what they said on the surface, which was clear enough, but for what the surface revealed about the structure underneath it. The structure underneath it was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of incompetent planning or poor strategic logic. The planning was technically proficient. The logic within the parameters it was given was sound. The wrongness was in the parameters. The campaign objectives kept changing in ways that technical proficiency and sound logic could not account for. Worlds that had been designated for sustained occupation were designated for withdrawal after investment of resources and lives that made withdrawal strategically nonsensical. Offensives were launched toward targets that had no obvious strategic value relative to their cost, and then sustained past the point where any honest accounting would have called them viable. Resources were allocated to operations in sectors that had been, in earlier planning documents, designated as secondary theaters. And when Verith mapped the resource flows against the stated campaign objectives, the flows did not correspond to the objectives in any configuration he could produce. He spent 3 nights with the documents before he understood what he was looking at. He was looking at 2 strategies occupying the same documents. One strategy was the campaign as described, the reclamation of Republic space, the establishment of imperial sovereignty over contested regions, the political and military objectives that had been the stated purpose of the war since Coriban. This strategy was real. It was being executed. People were dying for it in the standard way that people died for stated strategies, with the belief that the dying served the stated purpose. The second strategy was not stated anywhere. It was present only in the residue that the first strategy's anomalies produced when you looked at them long enough to stop explaining them as errors and start understanding them as intentions. The second strategy was the Emperor's, not Vitiate's public face, not the Dark Council's version of the campaign, but something underneath all of it that used the campaign the way a frame uses a canvas. The campaign was the visible surface. Underneath it, something else was being built or fed or accumulated in ways that the operational documents did not describe and were not designed to describe. He could not determine what the something else was. He did not have sufficient access. He had enough access to see its outline in the anomalies, the specific shape of a space where the stated explanation stopped fitting and the actual explanation had not been provided. He sat with this shape for a long time. He turned it over. He applied the agricultural survey patience to it, held it without resolving it, understood that not resolving it was not a failure of analysis, but an accurate representation of the limits of available information. Then he opened the history text to the section on the founding of the Republic Senate, a chapter he had read many times about the early deliberations that had produced the Republic's governing compact, about the arguments that had been made for and against the centralization of political authority in a single galactic body. It's about the people who had built the institution that he had spent 5 years fighting. He found the margin. He picked up the stylus he kept in his kit beside the notebook. He wrote in the small, careful letters he used for margin notes, in the space beside a passage about the Senate's original mandate to represent the interests of its constituent populations. They didn't tell us what we were for. He looked at what he had written for a moment. Then he closed the text and placed it back in the kit in its usual position. He did not speak of it to Doss. He did not speak of it to anyone. There was nothing to say that was also useful to say. The understanding was complete, and the understanding was private. and the field between complete private understanding and available action was the same field it had always been in this war, which was a field that did not permit the kind of movement that would have made any difference. He said the names that night, all of them, from the beginning. The list was long enough now that saying all of them took a meaningful portion of the time before sleep. He said them anyway. He had never shortened the list. He would not start now. In the committee room on the Senate building's 14th level, the viewport looked onto an internal corridor. Nothing moved in the corridor during sessions. It was an administrative level. The people who used it were not there during committee hours. The viewport showed a lit, empty corridor. Clean, functional, absolutely still. The evidence of a building designed for occupation that was not currently occupied. Shah, the senator who had voted against the supply route authorization, had looked at this viewport during the session following the operational reports. He had looked at it for approximately 4 seconds before returning his attention to the table. Whether he was thinking about the corridor or thinking about something the corridor allowed him to not think about is not a distinction the record can make. He voted on 12 more measures in the remaining sessions of that year. Arda was present for all 12 votes. She read the room at each one. She filed her assessments through the proper channels. She did not file anything else. She was running out of space in the place where she kept the things she could not do anything about, and she was aware of running out of space, and she was not sure what happened when the space was full. She would find out in the chapters that remained. The assignment came on a morning that looked like other mornings. This is the thing about the moments that determine everything. They do not announce themselves with different weather or a change in the quality of light. The light on the morning Arda received the Alderaan delegation assignment was the same light that had been coming through the temple's eastern windows, so for as long as the temple had stood. The corridor she walked to receive the assignment was the same corridor. The master who gave it to her spoke in the same register he used for every assignment, which was the register of institutional necessity, calm, precise, carrying the weight of a decision already made at a level above this conversation. She was told she would accompany the Jedi peace delegation to Alderaan. She was told this because she was good at reading rooms. The master said this directly, which she respected. He did not frame it as an honor or a recognition of her standing. He framed it as a functional requirement. The delegation needed someone who could read the Sith Imperial negotiators in real time, who could identify the gap between what was being said and what was being meant, who could be present in the room in the specific way that made the other side believe good faith was possible, even when good faith was not what anyone in the room was fully operating from. She was that person. She was being sent because she was that person. She accepted the assignment. She said the words the acceptance required. She left the office. She went to the temple roof. The hour was the hour she used to teach her morning class. The hour that no longer held a class, because the class had been suspended after the sacking and had not been reformed, because the students who had constituted it were gone in the various ways that war disperses the things it touches. She went to the roof at that hour out of a habit that had lost its object but not its pull, the way roots persist in the body after the destination changes. The city spread below her in its morning configuration. The upper levels in the early light, the Senate towers visible to the southwest, the Founder-Tide quarters mid-level roof lines 2 kilometers distant and below, the ordinary evidence of a civilization continuing its ordinary functions on an ordinary morning. She had looked at this view many times. She looked at it now with the specific attention of someone who understands they are looking at something they need to hold clearly before the next thing happens. She knew about the fleet movements. She had been in the committee room. She had read the assessments. She had seen the intelligence that described Sith Imperial fleet positioning across 3 sectors. Positioning that was consistent with preparation for a major offensive operation. Positioning that the committee's analysts had flagged as concerning, and that the committee's decision-making body had managed in the way it managed concerning information, which was carefully and with attention to what the management required. She had filed her own assessment. She knew what the fleet movements looked like when you read them without the management, when you read them the way she had been reading things for years, with the attention to what a text was actually doing beneath what it appeared to be doing. The fleet movements looked like a distraction being prepared for. The delegation to Alderaan was the distraction. She did not know this with certainty. She knew it the way she knew rooms, not through evidence that would satisfy a formal inquiry, but through the accumulated reading of enough information at close enough range to understand the shape of what the pieces were forming. The delegation was real. The peace talks were real. The possibility that the talks would produce something genuine was not zero. She had been in enough negotiations to know that genuine outcomes emerged from situations that did not appear to permit them. The possibility was not zero. It was not large. She stood on the temple roof and she ran the calculation. If she refused the assignment, if she went back to the master's office and said she would not go, that her reading of the intelligence suggested the delegation was a strategic instrument rather than a genuine diplomatic initiative, that sending the Jedi to Alderaan while the fleet moved served the Sith's purposes more than the Republic's. The delegation would still go. Another Jedi would fill her function. The room would still be read by someone. The management of good faith would still be performed. The thing she was being sent to do would be done by someone else. And the outcome would be what the outcome was going to be, regardless of whether she was present for it. If she went, if she accepted the assignment and boarded the transport and sat in the room on Alderaan and read the negotiations with her full capability, she would be present for whatever the delegation became. She would be part of it. She would have been the one reading the room on Alderaan, while behind her, 2 systems away, the city she had walked every morning for 7 years, received what the fleet had been positioned to deliver. She would have been the one who was not there. She stood with both sides of this for a long time. The morning light moved. The city continued below her. She did not find a third option because there was not a third option. There was only this choice that was not a choice. Only the question of whether she was used or whether someone else was used. And in either case, the thing happened. She did not tell herself this was right. She told herself it was real. She went back inside. She packed her kit. She moved through the preparation with the efficiency of someone who has made a decision and is now inside it, past the point of the decision, in the territory where only the execution remains. She did not go to the classroom. She had already said what needed saying in the classroom, and she would not go back and say it again, because going back would be a performance of grief rather than the thing itself, and she had no time for performances. She recited names, walking the corridor toward the departure bay. Youngest first. All of them. She said Devan's name, and she said it without stopping. She said all the names she had been adding without being ready to add them, and she said them completely in order to the end. She boarded the transport. On the same day, by the Republic calendar, by the Imperial calendar, by the field time reckoning that Verith used, which was simply the day before the counterattack. Verith stood in a district on a world whose name he had to check his assignment orders to produce. The district was mixed population. Republic civilians, people who had been in this settlement before the Imperial ground operation had reached their sector, who had not been evacuated, who were present in the buildings around him in the specific way of people who have decided that remaining is less dangerous than moving, and who may or may not have been right about this. His Imperial conscript labor, workers brought in during the operation's early phases to manage supply infrastructure, non-military personnel in a military zone, the category of people who appeared in operational planning documents as a logistics consideration. The order was to hold the district against an expected Republic counterattack. Hold the district. Prevent Republic forces from establishing a resupply position in the sector. The order was clear, and the order was legitimate within the operational framework, and the order was his to execute. He looked at the district. He looked at the defensive positions available to him. He did this with the professional attention of an officer who had spent 5 years developing exactly this capability. The ability to read terrain, to identify where a defensive line would hold and where it would not, to calculate the relationship between position and outcome with the accuracy that experience produces. The optimal positions were inside the civilian buildings. He could see this clearly. The buildings provided structural cover, elevated firing positions, fields of observation, that the open ground of the district's central area did not. A unit holding from inside the buildings could hold the district with fewer personnel casualties than a unit holding from outside them. The arithmetic of the optimal position was straightforward, and the arithmetic was in favor of being inside the buildings. The people who lived in the buildings would still be in the buildings. He stood with this for the time it took to stand with it. Not long, because the counterattack's expected window did not permit long deliberation, and because the decision was not actually difficult in the way that difficult decisions are difficult. It was clear. The clarity was the uncomfortable part. The optimal position produced an outcome he was not willing to produce. The less optimal position produced 2 additional variables in his unit's casualty projection. He held both outcomes, and he chose. He gave orders that placed his unit outside the civilian structures, in the less optimal positions, without explaining why the less optimal positions were the ones he had chosen. His unit executed the orders without question. His unit trusted his tactical judgment. His tactical judgment had been, across 5 years, consistently sound. They did not know that today it was not purely tactical. The counterattack came. His unit held the district. The district's civilian population was not inside a defended structure when the counterattack's fire came through the sector. This was the outcome he had chosen. This was what the choice had been for. 2 soldiers died who would not have died in the optimal position. He knew their names. He had known their names before the counterattack, from the manifest, in the way he knew all the names in his unit, specifically by habit, by the practice he had been building since the list began. He added them to the notebook. He wrote carefully. He did not rush the writing. The names deserved the care of being written at the pace that writing names requires. He closed the notebook. He said the names, not just the 2 new ones, all of them, from the beginning. In the dark of the field command post, with the sounds of the district settling into its post-engagement state outside, the specific quiet of a place where shooting has recently stopped and is not yet certain to have stopped permanently, he said the names from the first name to the last. The list took the time it took. He gave it the time. 2 people, different worlds, different sides of the same war, each of them in the dark, with a list of names they were still adding to. Each of them saying the names before the next thing happened, because the next thing was always coming, and the names needed saying before it arrived. Neither of them knew about the other. Neither of them knew that on the same day, at hours that the dual calendars would record differently and that soldiers in the field would not record at all, two people had stood in front of choices that were not choices and had chosen the thing they could live with over the thing that was optimal. The transport to Alderaan moved through hyperspace. The field command post's lights dimmed for the night cycle. The names had been said. The next thing was coming. The Treaty of Coruscant was signed on the 14th day of the Mediator's month by the Republic calendar. By the Imperial calendar, it was the 22nd of Sarathas, the month named what was ours, which the Dark Council had chosen for the signing with the deliberate intention of that meaning. The soldiers on both sides did not use either date. They called it the day the shooting was supposed to stop, with the qualifier supposed to be maintained for several weeks afterward, by people who had learned not to trust the distance between what documents said and what actually happened in the sectors where the documents had not yet fully arrived. The document itself was 11 pages. It acknowledged Sith territorial gains across 14 Outer Rim systems. It released Sith prisoners in exchange for Republic prisoners at a ratio that both sides' official communications described as equitable, and that neither side's soldiers believed was equitable, because soldiers who have been in the field understand that the word equitable in a treaty means something has been traded that was not the negotiators to trade. It contained a cessation of hostilities clause that used the phrase end to armed conflict in its formal designation, and that contained, in its implementation annex, 17 exceptions and conditional provisions that legal officers on both sides would spend the next decade interpreting. The political framing called it peace. The people who signed it knew what it was. It was exhaustion made into paper. It was two civilizations that had been bleeding for 8 years, reaching the specific threshold where continuing cost more than whatever either side had originally decided the war was for, and agreeing, without stating this in the document's language, that the threshold had been reached and the accounting was complete and the dying could stop now. Not because the issues were resolved, not because either side had achieved what it intended when the fleet first moved over Coriban, because the arithmetic had run out. Arda was on a medical transport when the announcement came. The transport was 3 days out from a border engagement that had no name yet in the official record, a minor action, the kind that the war generated in its final weeks, with the specific wastefulness of systems that have not fully received the information that they are ending. Both sides technically still fighting. Both sides aware at the command level that the negotiators were in the final stages. Nobody had told the people doing the shooting that the negotiators were in the final stages, because the negotiators were not yet done, and telling people prematurely produced its own category of problems. So the shooting continued in the border sectors, with the grim momentum of something that did not know how to stop until it was told explicitly to stop. She was not wounded. She was on the medical transport. Because when the engagement ended and the available transports were inventoried for the return routing, the medical transport was what had space. She had a bunk in the corridor outside the medical bay. Not inside it, because the medical bay was for the people who needed it, and she did not need it in the way that required a medical bay. She needed a surface to sit on and a direction to travel in, and the specific absence of anything being asked of her for 72 hours. The corridor bunk provided all three. She heard the announcement from the crew section. Not the words first, the sound of it. The change in the ship's ambient noise that indicated something had happened. A gathering of voices in a register she recognized as the register of people receiving information that permits relief. Then the words, carried through the corridor's ventilation and the open hatch of the crew section. Cessation of hostilities. Treaty signed. End to armed conflict. The crew celebrated. It was a small celebration, tired, genuine, the sound of people who had been waiting for something bad to end and had now been told it had ended and were responding to this information with the portion of themselves that was still capable of responding to good news. She heard it from the corridor. She did not move toward it. She was not incapable of relief. She knew what relief felt like. She had felt it at the end of engagements, at the confirmation of successful operations, at the moments when the specific thing she had been dreading did not happen. Relief was available to her as a response. The shape this celebration required was not relief. It was victory. The sound from the crew section had the shape of victory, of an ending that meant something had been won, that the cost had purchased something, in that the dying had been in the direction of something that was now achieved. She could not inhabit that shape. The shape did not fit what she knew about what the treaty was, and what the cost had been, and what the dying had purchased, which was a cessation and a document, and 17 conditional provisions, and 14 outer rim systems that the Republic had agreed to stop defending. She went to the observation port at the end of the corridor. Hyperspace outside the port was the color it always was, the blue-white of a universe moving past faster than it was meant to move. The visual evidence of the hull's complaint made visible the light of transit. She had looked at hyperspace from many vessels across 8 years of a war that was now, on paper, over. She had learned to find it neither calming nor agitating, simply present, and simply the view that was available when there was no other view, the universe's way of showing you what between looked like. She began to recite names. Youngest first. Pell. She said the name. She said it with the full weight of what she now understood saying it to mean. Not keeping track, not administrative continuity. Refusing abstraction, insisting that each name was a specific person who had been real and who remained real in the only way available to her, which was this: Sarah Joan Maret. She said Davin's name without stopping. She said Ika, Torith. She said Ru. She said Cassell. She came to Sael. Sael had died in the lower temple sections during the sacking of Coruscant. 14 years old, left-handed. Had held tension in the left shoulder. Had asked questions that went underneath the questions. Had wanted the real answers. She's not the version for the briefings. Had stood in the doorway of the classroom on the last morning and asked, "When you come back, will you tell me how it actually goes?" Ardeva had been on Alderaan. She said Sael's name. She said it in the corridor of the medical transport with hyperspace outside the observation port and the sounds of a small, tired celebration coming through the ventilation from the crew section. She said it the way she said all the names, without ceremony, without the drama of grief's performance, with the simple insistence of someone who refuses to let a name become only a name. She said it, and it was real, the saying of it in the way that the most essential things are real. Not comfortably, not with resolution, but completely. Then she said the rest, Torvan at the end in his separate category, as then the names she had added across 8 years from the field. The soldiers she had served alongside, who were not on Coruscant and not in her classroom. The people the war had made her responsible for in various capacities who had not survived those capacities. She said all of them. When she finished, hyperspace was still outside the port. The crew section had quieted. The ship moved through the between at the speed that ships move when they are going somewhere, and the somewhere is no longer a war. She stood at the port for a long time after the names were done. She did not know what she was now. Jedi Knight. Still, the designation remained. The training remained. The capability remained. But the thing she had been before the war, the person who had walked the same route every morning and taught children in the morning light and believed that the framework she had been given was adequate to the world the framework would encounter. That person had been replaced by this one, gradually, through the specific replacement process that 8 years of a war performs on the people inside it. She was not damaged. She was changed. The distinction mattered to her, and she held it carefully. The transport moved through hyperspace toward Coruscant. She stayed at the port until the stars returned. The formation was called for the 3rd hour of the Imperial morning cycle. Verith's unit assembled in the installation's primary yard, a flat, open space that had been a Republic administrative compound before the Imperial operation had made it something else, that still carried in its architecture the evidence of what it had been before. The unit assembled in the order formations, assembled, by rank, by assignment, in the organized geometry that military bodies produce when called to produce it. The physical expression of a hierarchy that had been built over years and that continued to function even when, as now, several of the positions in the hierarchy were occupied by people who had moved into them through the attrition of the people who had occupied them before. The commanding officer read the treaty terms. He read them in the flat register that official communications were read in. The register that conveyed the content without editorializing the content, that transferred the information to the formation without performing a response to the information. He read the territorial acknowledgements. He read the prisoner exchange provisions. He read the cessation language. He read the implementation timeline. Verith stood in the formation and listened. He listened with the patience he had been developing for 8 years, the patience of someone who reads beneath the surface of what is being said to find the structure underneath it. He listened to the treaty terms the way he had read the operational planning documents, the way he had read the Republic Agricultural Survey, the way he had read everything he had ever read that mattered, with attention to what the text was actually doing beneath what it appeared to be doing. What the treaty was doing, underneath its formal language of cessation and acknowledgement and exchange, was describing a threshold, 2 sides reaching it simultaneously. Neither side's official language was capable of saying this directly, so both sides said it indirectly through the specific provisions they had accepted, through the territorial acknowledgements that represented the Republic's admission that it could not recover what it had lost, and through the cessation language that represented the Empire's admission that what it had gained was not what it had been fighting for, not the reclamation, not the thing that Coriban had promised on the morning the fleet rose. Both sides had reached the threshold. Both sides had agreed to stop. The treaty was the paperwork. He thought about the troop bay, the dark, the hyperspace sound, DOS across the narrow space between bunks, asking her question with the seriousness of someone who genuinely wanted to know. "Ja, do you think the people who started this know what they're asking us to finish?" He had thought for a long time before answering. He had thought long enough that she had waited past the point where most people would have assumed the question had been set aside. She had waited because she knew him well enough to know he was still thinking. He had said, "I think the people who started this understood exactly what they were asking us to finish. That's what I'm afraid of." He had been right. He stood in the formation, and he was right. And being right produced nothing. No satisfaction, no bitterness. No, the specific elevation that being vindicated sometimes produces in people who waited a long time for the vindication. It produced only the weight of having known something true for a long time and having continued anyway, because the alternative to continuing had not been available in any form he could actually choose. He had checked DOS before the formation. She was alive. She was being processed for demobilization at a staging installation on a world 17 light-years from where he was standing. She was alive and functional and moving through the demobilization process with, he suspected, the professional efficiency she brought to everything. He would not see her for a long time, possibly not again. The war was over, and the structures it had built, including the structure of their proximity to each other, were beginning to dissolve into whatever the peace would produce instead. She was alive. This was the primary information. He held it as the primary information. The commanding officer finished reading, and he asked if there were questions in the formal way that commanders ask when they are not expecting questions. There were no questions. The formation was held for the procedural moment that formations were held after official communications were delivered, and then it was dismissed. Verith did not move immediately. He stood in the yard after the formation dissolved around him, the unit dispersing into the installation spaces, the geometry of the formation coming apart into the informal movement of people who have been released from a structure and are returning to the less organized version of themselves. He stood in the space where the formation had been, and he looked at the installation's perimeter and beyond it at the sky of this world, which was a sky he had never learned the name of the color of, because he had never been somewhere long enough to learn the name of the color. He reached into his kit. He took out the notebook. He did not add any names. There were no names to add today. The war's last engagement for his unit had been 6 days ago, and its accounting was already in the notebook, already said, already held. He simply held the notebook. He felt its weight, the physical weight of paper and binding and years of ink, the specific accumulated mass of everything he had put in it, since the first entry after Harrick's absence made the morning formation into something he needed to do something about. The notebook was heavier than it had been when he started it. This was simply true. He put it back in the kit. He said the names. Not all of them. Not right now in the yard, but the most recent ones, the last ones added. He said them quietly. He gave them the time they required. Then he picked up the kit and he walked toward the installation's interior. And the war was over, and he was still inside it in the way that people are still inside the things that shape them. And he did not know yet what the outside of it would look like, or whether outside was a place he would reach. He walked. The yard was empty behind him. The treaty held.